This is the DRS train.
In 2024, we're seeing a multiple world champion pull wins out of the hat against faster cars that are seemingly out of reach, while his teammate is nowhere to be seen. In 2012, we saw a multiple world champion pulling wins out of the hat that was seemingly out of reach, while his teammate was nowhere to be seen. But how out of the reach were they really? I'm Peter Brook, I'm joined by Ciaron Smith and professional Italian Ace Shield, and you're listening to the DRS Train podcast. So, the 2012 Ferrari is a bit of an interesting car because a lot of people like to insist that it's possibly the worst race winning and worst title contending car in Formula One history. Because across the season, we saw that there were a lot of races where it was wildly uncompetitive. Felipe Massa got only one podium and had lots of races where he was in the midfield, but Alonso was able to consistently get at the front, and he took the title fight all the way to the wire, which is probably what from a single driver one of the best championship performances ever, even if he lost the championship. But yeah, so what we're going to do today is basically go race by race and look at how we think, was that car really as bad as people say it is? Because I don't know about you two, my general consensus is that it's better than people say when they insist it was a midfield car. It's like, it's obviously a front runner, but it was very competitive at the front. But it's still a race winning car, and so it's still, as far as I'm concerned, it still needs to be a reasonably good one for that to happen.
If we only look at the first 4 races, yes, the Ferrari is a midfielder. Looking across the entire year, Ferrari probably is the third best car. But that's not what is unusual. The really unusual part is that the way that Ferrari started so badly and then became competitive. And then what happened next? So we start with all the teams in testing, because it's important to remember that for 2012, the key point is that the FDAC from 2011, the technical tricks that Red Bull used, mastered to dominate the year, were banned. They were set rules so that these effects could not be used. And some teams still found a way around it to still find a performance. And so key to the year is the Coanda effect. And interestingly, it was not Newey who developed the idea. It was from Sauber. The Sauber debuted at winter testing in Jerez with a rear end of the car that was only similar to McLaren, and everybody else was different. It was classical, normal, how it was intended by the rules. Sauber instead was doing something different. And the following day, as legend has it, and by legend I mean paddock rumors, it is said that Dewey took a look at the car, and after the first day started to work on his own car to completely change it and to copy what Sauber was doing. But we're going now far ahead, because this process that Dewey starts from the second day of winter testing will go on all the way until the end of the year. He continuously works on the car, on the rear end, on making use of this Coanda effect. And the other teams are doing something different. But let's first look at Australia. How are the drivers, the cars at Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. And in Australia, it wasn't a beautiful picture. One thing I just want to add color to is some of the changes from the 2011 Ferrari to the 2012 Ferrari before we jump into Australia, because there were quite a few. And if we look at some of the key ones, I mean, first of all, the car had a pull rod suspension at the front. So the F2012 was the only car on the grid to have a pull rod suspension. It had a longer wheelbase than the 2011 Ferrari. The drivers were sitting lower in the cockpit. And, you know, as we kind of touched on earlier in testing, there was a lot going on. And in testing and in Australia, the drivers were reporting understeer on corner entry and oversteer on exit. We've heard that before with Ferrari cars in the past 2 decades or so. And especially in since the Alonso era, as I call it, these cars have they've just understeered massively. One thing I just want to point out is that there's quite a big difference between a pull rod suspension and a push rod. So I mean, for listeners, I mean, some of the differences come from the fact that the suspension arm is actually connected from the top of the upright to the bottom of the chassis, and the internal components are actually lower in the chassis. So Ferrari were thinking that there were two advantages over the push rod, right? So they thought that if they're placing the suspension components closer to the ground, their center of gravity would be lower, and so the suspension arm is going to be able to basically tackle airflow from the front wing towards the side pod, so they would have some aerodynamic gain. But there's also some basically disadvantages because it's just a lot longer to fine tune a pull rod, right? And given what Ace mentioned, that there was limited testing time, the teams really need to quickly change the damper tuning settings. And if the components are harder to reach because of a pull rod, you actually lose track time trying to set up the car. So the benefit of switching to the pull rod was widely thought to be a very small aero gain at the expense of the convenience of tuning your car as you want. So right off the, right from the beginning of the season, I think many people were questioning Ferrari's route when it came to front suspension. And that kind of set the tone going to Australia, where, both drivers were off the pace. One of them was massively off the pace, but Fernando was at least able to salvage something. And I definitely think he did a good job, given that car was not in the top four on pace at the beginning of the year.
It is true. The pull rod suspension at the front was very much doubted. So many did not see the reason why Ferrari should have switched to a pull rod. It has its advantages, it has its disadvantages, and it didn't appear to be a better option than keeping the push rod at the front. So that is a question mark. And the reason is simply that Alonso asked it. Alonso wanted the pull rod at the front, and the team gave him the pull rod at the front. But it is unfair to believe that the pull rod was the problem of the car. It wasn't. And it is shown by the fact that across the entire year, the Ferrari never does anything to the suspensions. From the beginning to the end, the suspension, both suspensions, front and rear, remain the same, but the car improves. So what is the other issue on the Ferrari? The other issue is that they, for some reason, the engineers didn't work well enough on the rear of the car. It was not doing what they wanted it to do. So Ferrari was still not using the Coanda effect, but was doing something similar. Not exactly the Coanda effect, but something that gets closer to it compared to the traditional rear end intended by the regulations. So, okay, let's start talking about how the regulation intended the rear of the car to be. So the key point is that the exhaust has to face upwards. The hot air that is ejected from the exhaust should go upwards, and that was it. What Sauber and McLaren were able to do with their Coanda effect was to make the hot air, yes, ejects upwards, but then as soon as it exits the exhaust pipe, it bends downward and sticks to the chassis, to the bodywork. And that is huge because if the hot air sticks to the bodywork, then you can design the bodywork to bring this hot air wherever you want. So to make use of the Coanda effect, you can mainly do three things with the hot air. You can direct it on top of the rear diffuser, and so that enhances the downforce from the floor. You can direct it to the in front of the rear tires, and so you have a tool to manage the temperature of the rear tire and overall tire management. You can design it by designing the flow of hot air. And finally, you can direct it to the DRS on top of the wing through some weird escamotage. You can get it on top of the rear wing so that it enhances the DRS effect. And it is a great advantage also because the hot air that sticks to the bodywork, I don't know how it works physically, so I'm just going to explain what was explained to me. The hot air has a certain speed, and it is fixed by the speed it exits the exhaust pipe. Whilst instead the bodywork of the car itself, has different speeds. The bigger the difference is between the hot air and the car, the more downforce this hot air generates on the car. And this is excellent out of low-speed corners, because that's when the difference is the biggest, and that's where the downforce the command effect generates is the biggest. And of course, at low-speed corners, usually you don't have an aerodynamic load, so you only ride on the mechanical grip of the car. So the command effect is a great tool because it gives you an aerodynamic tool to generate downforce even at low-speed corner turns. So the cars that use the command effect tend to have the best tire management, but only if it is perfectly done. If you screw it up, you are screwed. You have a great downforce, and especially in low-speed corners. Now, to obtain the command effect, you need to design the rear of the car such that you force the hot air to stick to the bodywork, but you also have to work on the exhaust pipe itself. Instead of having a mostly straight, short exhaust, you have to tangle it up, to wind it up more, so that the air stays in the exhaust for longer. The exhaust is also longer because it does more twists and turns. And this is paid with engine power. If you want the command effect, if you want the traction, the tire management, the downforce, you pay for it with engine power, because for longer exhaust pipes, the engine works more, and so it can deliver less power. The difference is 2%, so for those engines, it ranges from 15 to 20 horsepower. So this is important because it meant that even though the command effect was the best way to build the 2012 car, even if you didn't use it, you could still be competitive. An example is the Lotus. The Lotus only introduces the command effect at the end of the year, only on Kimi Raikkonen's car. And let me see exactly what race was it.
Well, of course, only on Kimi Raikkonen's car. I mean, he's their lead driver, so you would only put it on for him, not for the other ones.
Grosjean would just crash and destroy it anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah, true. So on Lotus debuted the command effect in Korea, and they screwed it up. They had to fix it in the next races. But that's far longer in the future than what we're currently dealing. What we're currently dealing is Ferrari. And Ferrari screwed this up. So what Ferrari was trying to do didn't work, and they were burning the rear tires with this hot air. It wasn't completely enveloping the rear tires. It was only half enveloping it. So the rear tires were mixing temperature. There was one part very hot and the other part very cold, and so the car was undrivable. Throughout winter testing, they try to work on this issue, and the best they can come up with as a quick fix is to simply cut the exhaust short. And so the rear of the the rear of the car and sooner. And this has some very bad effect on the car. So I'm just gonna list what this quick fix did to the car. It meant that in Australia, the Ferrari had abysmal top speed. They were 9 kilometers per hour slower than the McLaren. And in Malaysia, where the issue still remains, their top speed was faster than only HRT, Marussia, and Marussia. Everybody else was faster than Ferrari in the straights. It meant that the aero balance was completely off the charts. It was completely screwed up, the aero balance. It wasn't where it needed to be. And finally, it still degraded the tires massively. And it didn't deliver traction out of low-speed corners. In Australia, the Ferrari has only two good properties. It has excellent curse deployment and recharge, thanks to a good engine, and then it behaved very well in high-speed corners. That's it. Everything else about the Ferrari is bad. So I'm just gonna read what was commented at the time. The car is iron balanced. Reason is also the terminal of the exhaust, which folds too soon inwards to not burn the rear tires. The ones working best are those very forward, that allow to use the shape of the side pods. The side pods for now have kept the same shape, thus there is more bodywork needed, and that creates an aero problem. Simply moving the exhaust forward implies changing the manifold's length, and thus the resonance frequency of the pressure waves which determine the good yield of the engine. The fact that what this all means is that Ferrari screwing up the rear of the tire is not an easy fix. It takes a lot of time. The first upgrades that actually fixes this will come in Spain, and then the final solution in Canada.
So before you continue, Ace, because I think this is an incredible context that we definitely need to discuss, why don't we jump into the first race and then go quickly race by race and kind of detail, the changes and the updates on a race by race basis, so that I think listeners can get a better sense of how these changes progressed over the season. So from what I understand and what I remember, and from what you just eloquently stated, the car had a bad handling characteristic. Okay, it was understeering. We know it lacked grip, and it was working the rear tires way too hard, and that hurt degradation, and the top speed was abysmal. So we can definitely say that this car was a midfield car at best in Australia, and Massa was absolutely so far off the pace that they decided that they were going to give him a new chassis for the next race in Sepang. So credit to Alonso. I don't know how he did this, but he dragged that thing to a top 5 position. What do you guys think about that weekend from Ferrari? Do you agree with my assessment there?
Yeah, I mean, both drivers got eliminated in Q1. So off that bat, you would say, okay, this is definitely a midfield car. They were lined up more or less for the Salvers, who were their main who were Ferrari customer team, so same engine. But yeah, Alonso got himself up into 5th in a race that was it was a fairly tame race. I mean, there were some retirements, including Massa himself, collision damage about 3/4 of the way through. But even before that, he wasn't anywhere. But yeah, Alonso, he got himself up to 5th. He was still quite far off the front runners, because the top 4 was the Red Bulls and the McLarens. They were within 5 seconds of one another. And then he was another 16, 17 seconds behind. And then had Kobayashi another 15 seconds behind that. So he kind of got himself into a position where he was running on his own, basically.
Yeah. Objectively, and I think this order changed as the year went on. So keep in mind, this is just at the beginning of the year. I think the pecking order was something like McLaren first, Red Bull second, Lotus third, with Williams close behind in 4th, Sauber 5th, and Ferrari probably the 6th best team that weekend. That's what I think. At Australia only. I don't want people to think that's for the entire season, because that hierarchy switched quite a bit, as we'll get to later. So tremendous job there by Alonso to snag a 5th place. So gave Ferrari a lot of work to do going into Malaysia.
Yeah. Malaysia, obviously, very different results because we somehow saw Alonso win that race, even though he was being hounded by, of all people, Checo Perez right at the end of it. But this early season, it was interesting because famously in 2012, it's known for having 7 different winners in the first 7 races. One reason I think that maybe things were so competitive is that we've talked about the Coanda exhaustor that Ferrari used that. Every team seemed to have something of that, or the front running teams all had something unique or different about their car that made it be competitive at one point or another. Because you said Sauber and Lotus also used the Coanda effect. Mercedes had their famous double DRS, which they helped them win in China. Red Bull, they'd taken away their smoking gun of the off-throttle exhaust blown diffuser, and instead they just punched some holes in the floor, which everyone insisted were illegal, and that helped them a lot of the season. McLaren somehow avoided a step nose. Ferrari, though, in pre-season testing, they'd also developed a sort of reactive ride height system, but then that got banned very swiftly. And the pull rod suspension, front suspension, interesting choice, as I think the last teams to use that were Minardi and Arrows in 2001. So not exactly competitive teams. Maybe Alonso wanted it because, of course, he drove for Minardi in 2001. So for all you know, he has fond memories of that. But yeah, they all seem to be coming up with unique ideas. Another interesting one, of course, is Williams. And this is that again is a completely different topic about how good was that car really. Because when Maldonado won in Spain, the party line was that it was because they developed these new brake ducts and that was making the tyres last. But then they instead, oh, well, by Monaco, everyone else had the same brake ducts. So our relative position went back to exactly where it was. Definitely not, maybe special birthday Pirelli tyres for Frank to make them win that they then burn in the garage after the race to hide the evidence.
One quick interjection. I think Alex Wirtz, who was a team advisor of some sort at the time, he was with the team in some role.
Yeah, he was.
He said that Williams had found a way to heat the rim of the tire, so they were heating the rims as well, and this gave them a better ability to switch on the tires right from the outset of the race. And then, in addition to what you mentioned, Peter, the other teams caught on to that. So that suggests that the Williams was a mightily quick car, especially in the first half of the season. I forgot to also just mention Mercedes in my ranking that I made in Australia. I'd probably put them below Williams in 5th. It doesn't change the fact that Ferrari was behind them as well. But back to your point, I do think the Williams was a mighty car and certainly quicker than the Ferrari by the second race of the season, that's for sure.
It's very interesting the point about the brake ducts and what Williams was doing, because across the entire year, basically all the top 5 teams, so Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull, Lotus, and Mercedes, they constantly have new brake ducts at the front, at the rear, of a different shape. In all the damn races, there is one new brake duct or one different front wing which has a flap slightly bigger than before. So it's very interesting to see how all this team works so much on the brake ducts. And the point is exactly that, heating up the tire, working the Pirelli tires. And often along this year, you will find teams that should be competitive and then have a disappointing race or slightly underwhelming performance. Most often than not, it is because they didn't nail the tire management. So these teams work a lot on that, and they constantly keep upgrading the brake ducts exactly to manipulate the tire for that specific track on those specific conditions that they find on the weekend they go racing. So aside from those upgrades, in another thing that Alonso asks from Ferrari, and this debuts in Malaysia, is a shaft connecting the gearbox to the chassis. It was introduced by Renault back for the 2001 engine, which was a huge flop. And so as a quick fix, Renault had developed this shaft connecting the two to give it more stability. And in 2012, Alonso got a Ferrari to also put it on their cars. And so that was the main upgrade for Malaysia. I don't know how much it brought to the car, but it is one of the few upgrades to the real upgrades to the car that Ferrari brings. Everything else is flaps or wings.
Yeah. I mean, I think it helped a bit because I think in qualifying, Alonso was eighth and Alonso was eighth and Massa was 12th, so a little bit better. But during the race, yeah, I mean, the first half was just a free for all because they had the heavy rain and the red flags. But then Alonso took the lead pretty much immediately after the restart when everyone was pitting and the track just gradually dried out. And he did win, even with Checo chasing him down at the end and then rather suspiciously messing up right when he was about to take the lead from another Ferrari, from the parent team to Sauber. But Massa himself was in the points for a while and then just went off a cliff and finished back in the midfield again.
Yeah, it was really a weekend salvaged by the driving brilliance, as much as I hate to say that, of Fernando Alonso, because he absolutely put that car in a position that weekend that it did not deserve to be in. Massa finished 15th in that car. And Felipe's not bad around Sepang. It's actually one of his better circuits. He was probably hampered by the fact he had a new chassis that felt just as bad as the one he had in Australia. So he was just, Massa was very much lost at sea with setup. But I also just think he was underperforming. Totally unacceptable to be 15th while your teammate is first. I mean, that's a crazy gap. And, I mean, what can you say about Perez? I mean, we thought that at that time he would mature as a driver. 10 years later, he looks more like Felipe Massa than he does Fernando Alonso, doesn't he? Shocking. I mean, how did he not win that race? It is suspicious to me, but we'll address that another time. But I think it gave Ferrari still a lot of work to do, and from what I understand, they went to Shanghai with some new rear wing components that they were hoping would address some of their tire management, tire degradation issues that they had seen, and top speed. But Ace, I don't know if you have anything you want to contribute to this particular point I'm making, but I don't think they really had the intended effect at Shanghai.
So for Shanghai and then Bahrain, Ferrari is bringing the first upgrade. It is the first upgrade to the car, aside from the shaft I talked about before. But it's not a really big upgrade. It was simply before winter testing, as they were developing the car, they got these first upgrades in the wind tunnel in the making, and that was before coming to winter testing. And so before they actually found out the issues with the car, so they did have hope for this small stuff. It is just flaps all around the car to direct better the airflow, and they hoped it could improve the situation. It really did not. The point is that in China, basically Ferrari is still the same issues, and the main issue in China is the top speed. You have a 1.2 kilometers straight, and Ferrari is sitting that. The drivers are just get overtaken and they can't fight back because the car would perform well in the corners, but you don't overtake in the corners, you overtake in the straight. And in the straight, you don't have the top speed. So Alonso, the entire race, is stuck in traffic, trying to change the strategy, trying to make impossible overtakes. Like at some point, he was overtaken by Kobayashi, which is basically a better Ferrari because it has the Ferrari engine and the Coanda effect actually working. And so Alonso has to invent some laps later an impossible overtake in the twisty section of the track. And then he actually finished in front of both Saubers, except that I think it was quite a disappointing performance from the Saubers, this one, given that the race before they were fighting for the win, and now they barely finished 10th in the points. But Sauber aside, which has thrown away one win and will keep a tab on that across the year, the Ferrari finally hits the ground. They finally see that the car is what it is, and that Alonso can't keep making miracles and bringing it higher up the field. Alonso finished 9 because the car deserved that place.
Yeah, I mean, Alonso also made a mistake in the race. Don't forget, he did go off the track and lose some positions, which was avoidable. That's a driving error. But overall, he still got points. Massa finished 13th, and Felipe had a two-stop race, and he was banking on others having higher tire degradation, but it wasn't the case. So it's funny because at this point, I can still say that Ferrari is a midfield car. I mean, I don't think it's quicker than the Sauber, Lotus, Williams, Mercedes, McLaren, or Red Bull. So at this point, race 3, you can still say that, yes, this is a midfield car, and Alonso is driving the wheels off it, if making a slight mistake in Shanghai, which cost him some positions. But that's also because he's pushing so hard and underperforming machinery. Peter, not sure if you have any other thoughts on that. That's how I looked at it.
Yeah, I mean, throughout the whole race, they were basically just going backwards because they qualified 9th and 12th. And then first lap, they were 8th and 10th. And then, as we said, they finished 9th and 13th in the race. And that's including Mercedes took the win, but then Schumacher had his retirement. And then Kimi famously had his tyres melt and him lose 10 places in one lap. But they got beaten. I mean, the Saubers went from third and 8th to 10th and 11th. So they had a bad race themselves, were only just behind. But they got beaten by both Williams, who started 13th and 14th. So yeah, not a brilliant race. And again, this was more of a sort of standard race because Malaysia was a bit chaotic and up and down. This went a bit more conventionally. And yeah, it's just looking like a midfield car because without those retirements and dodgy tyre things, yeah, they would have both been outside the points.
Talking about Mercedes, just to talk about what they were doing with their car, Mercedes is not using the coanda effect. They have a traditional rear end. What Ross Brown at Mercedes developed, though, was a double DRS system. So Peter already talked about it. So to explain what Mercedes were doing, basically, when the DRS activates, the flap opens up a hidden duct on the rear wing. The air in the duct is brought to the nose of the car and into the front wing, where it ejects on top of the front wing flaps. This causes both front and rear wing to stall, reducing aerodynamic resistance. And it also helps keeping the car balanced. And I cannot stress enough how good this system is because it single-handedly won them this race.
Absolutely. I remember some other teams experimenting with this later in the season, namely Lotus. It was billed at Spa that Kimi was going to dominate with a new double DRS system. Didn't really pan out, did it? But and what a shame that Mercedes won with Rosberg. It would have been nice for Michael to get a win on his comeback, and I think China 2012 was his best chance to do that, aside from Monaco, before he got penalized. Off topic, let me steer the conversation back to Ferrari and say that they had a lot of work to do, clearly, going into Bahrain. And, of course, in that weekend, I think Ferrari did show a little bit of improvement. One thing I want to note is I believe they added a monkey seat wing to the rear of their car. So one thing you can give Ferrari for is they didn't give up early. They kept adding little aerodynamic bits at almost every race to try and push this car up the grid. And I think we saw a slight improvement from China in Bahrain because apart from the fact that, Red Bull and Lotus were clearly the class of the field, Ferrari at least finished in the points with both drivers. And that's saying something because Massa was really struggling. at that point. So that was I think a beginning of a positive, let's say a positive trend in Ferrari's season, and I think it actually started in Bahrain and then was expedited in the following races. How do you guys see that?
For me, in Bahrain, it is Massa who really shows that the car, the monkey wing on the rear, actually helps, because Massa finished ninth and was only 2 places behind Alonso. So, and this time, unlike China, they could actually run a better race without always being in traffic. So yes, it really is starting to get better, especially the fact that throughout the year some teams keep screwing up the tire management, which I think is what Sauber did like in China. They finished an abysmal low of 10th, 11th, but they had qualified on the second row. So yet another. It will happen often for Sauber with Perez and Kobayashi. And in Bahrain, we had Vettel against Raikkonen. So, what do you have, guys, to say about that?
Well, I mean, yeah, go ahead, Peter.
I mean, Bahrain is more of a litmus test, I suppose, for competitiveness, because there's a reason it's used as a testing venue so much, because it has long straights, it has all the different corner types, it's tough on tires and brakes. So this gives you a better gauge of where performance is, and maybe it's half the reasons. Well, the races have only gotten good since it became a night race, but before then they weren't particularly exciting races. But yeah, for Ferrari in qualifying, there wasn't much that was different. Alonso didn't bother setting a time in Q3 so he could save tyres, but Massa was out in Q2. But yeah, they both made the point. So compared to China, where they were just going backwards, this time they were at least moving forwards, even if they were still miles off the front runners.
Well said. And Ferrari had something to work with, which I think was massively encouraging, because there was a test right after Bahrain that was great for Ferrari. It was at Mugello, and they experimented with tons of aerodynamic components, Pirelli tire testing. They had a massive rear end update on the final day of the test, a new exhaust layout. They also had put some humps under engine cover, and people thought that was the double DRS as well. So I think that Mugello test after the fourth race of the season was probably one where they learned quite a bit about their car. And going into Barcelona, I think they basically had a lot of good information to put on their car and try to get back to the front of the field on merit, which they did with one car in Spain. Any thoughts on that, guys, before we delve into Spain?
So, just want to point out that Ferrari never will develop a WRS system. It will be discussed long in the year many times that Ferrari is gonna bring this WRS. They will never bring the WRS. The only teams that will ever use the WRS are gonna be Mercedes, which is active and it got banned for 2013. Lotus, but theirs is a passive WRS. I will explain later when they'll bring the upgrade. And then Red Bull in Japan, they will bring a WRS rear wing, not as convoluted and developed as Mercedes. Mercedes stores both rear wing and front wing. What Red Bull will bring in Korea only works on the rear wing and only stores the rear wing. So it's not as developed as Mercedes, but it's still WRS. And before talking about the Spain upgrade for Ferrari, I want to talk about what Red Bull has been doing across the year. Because as I explained at the start, Red Bull had a philosophy for the car, and Newey will say that he was going very extreme on his philosophy, but then the FIA started to ban some of his solutions, so his philosophy wasn't going to work. And so after... So he started to work on the rear of the car to completely overhaul it. and to follow the cyber way, the Coanda effect. And already in Australia, they will bring a first specification for the rear end, which means the aside from the starting one, which they brought day one in testing, then they have a second rear of the car specification, which they used in testing at Barcelona later on, still winter testing, and then a third rear of the car specification for Australia. And Newey works a lot on this. For each races, it brings different versions of the rear with slightly different behaviors. And as an example, in China, Weber ran a new exhaust version, whilst Vettel wanted to try the original version, that of day one at Jerez. And in China, Weber will beat Vettel because the new version actually works better. Vettel will say that he felt the car behaved very well with the original specification, but then when you look at the lap times, when you look at the result, the improvement that Red Bull is bringing are really working, and that is seen in Bahrain. In Bahrain, they bring a new rear chassis, the fourth important alteration since the RB8 debuted in testing, and Vettel wins the race. Where did Weber finish in Bahrain?
Mark Webber finished not particularly in a good position. I believe it was, and I'm checking this as we're speaking. He
Fourth.
finished in fourth position, some 40 seconds behind Vettel. So, but yeah, fourth position still is pretty good.
So it is very big. It is a 40 seconds improvement from finishing right behind Weber in China to finishing 40 seconds ahead of Mark in Bahrain. That is what Red Bull was able to bring in 4 races. Now we'll discuss what Ferrari was able to bring in 5 races. And so, let me find the right page. Spain. The upgrades is a new front wing, a new diffuser, a new end part of the side pods to work well with the new exhaust, which is almost Lotus-like, a new central section of the engine cover, new barge boards under the chassis, and these barge boards no longer feature on under the front wing, but have been brought under the chassis. And with these upgrades, the Ferrari sees immediately improvement. Now, let's make this clear. Ferrari keeps downplaying this upgrade package all throughout the weekend. In Friday, they were saying, yeah, it's not worth much. In Saturday, after they qualify second, it's still not as good as people believe. And then in Sunday, when Alonso is fighting for the win, well, after Sunday, they finally say, yes, the upgrade has worked wonderfully. And that is unprecedented. It is what I was saying at the start, that what is unusual about this car, Ferrari brought a fix. It is not even the final fix. It is a stopgap until the upgrade in Canada. But this fix works wonderfully. The car actually works. It has more top speed. It has a better starting procedure for the clutch. It has still problems with traction out of low speed corners, but it has still more load on the rear.
Okay. I think the bottom line is that there are still problems with the car, but as you again eloquently put, the car made a huge gains in Spain. And I want listeners to remember something about Spain. This was the race, in my opinion, that the Ferrari was no longer a midfield car because Alonso qualified third on merit. It was something like I think it was 2 thousandths behind Maldonado, and he started on the front row after Hamilton got a penalty from qualifying. And remember, a lot of people will say, oh, well, look where Massa was. Massa was so far back, so the car must have been a midfield car. No, he was held up on his Q2 lap. So he was out of position relative to his own speed. And then in the race, he got a drive-through penalty. So, yes, Massa finished in abysmal 15th place, but that didn't reflect the true pace of the car. where Alonso finished did, because he finished second on merit. And this was the race where the Ferrari team showed they actually have a front running car now, and it's no longer a midfield car. And I just want to make that point because it's important for people listening to understand that, as you know, both of you have said, from Australia to Spain, the Ferrari made big gains, and we can't discount that. Any thoughts on that?
It is absolutely true. The Ferrari in Spain is no longer a midfield car. It is a front-running car, as is to say, for a 2024 equivalent, Ferrari. So it is not the straight out best car. It is second, third. Now it is fourth best because Mercedes and McLaren have improved. But even with the fourth best car in 2024, the Ferrari is still a front runner car. So that is what Ferrari is in Spain and Monaco in 2012. Not the best car, let's get this straight, but it is a car that is able to win. And it is interesting to see what Red Bull and McLaren did in Spain, which is not being competitive. Well, Lewis is excused because he did put the car on pole and then he had to start from the pit lane. Button starts his very disappointing run of very mediocre and disappointing results. And instead, Red Bull, I think they didn't get the tire management right in Spain, and so they weren't quite as competitive. And so that meant that for Spain, the fight for the win was between Williams, Ferrari, and Lotus. Because we should not forget that Lotus tried with Raikkonen a very, let's call it, aggressive strategy. They ran Raikkonen for longer in the two stints so that at the end he would have younger tires and he would be faster and he could overtake. And it nearly worked out because I think 1 or 2 more laps and Raikkonen was going to get Alonso. So that is another time that we can see the tire management is crucial. You don't get it right, you lose a lot of lap time. And so this explains why in 2012 the standings look to change from race to race very wildly.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, even with everything that had gone on after this race, Alonso was actually tied at the top of the standings with Vettel. Because they had, I mean, Red Bull had a particularly bad race. Vettel had made some mistakes. Mark Webber had a very near miss with Carter Kayan, I think, at one point, and they were. I think Vettel got a penalty as well for speeding or overtaking under yellows, similar to Massa, which didn't help them. It was kind of a curious race, though, to see them fighting with the Williams, and it was obvious that the Williams was better on the tyres, and like we said about heating the rim, because even though Alonso took the lead at the start, Maldonado managed to undercut him in, I think, the second stops, which was also helped by Alonso spending a whole lap stuck behind Charles Pic. But then, and in the final stint, he managed to pull away again, and then it was Raikkonen chasing down a finish just behind Alonso. But yeah, by now the car was definitely better. Massa would have probably been in the points without his penalty. I think he was on course for 5th or 6th and then plummets to 15th after the drive-through. But I have no idea. At this point, I don't have no idea where he would have been in the standings, but quite low down, I imagine.
Yes, but even Massa was making incremental improvements at the end of the day. And we really saw this come to the fore when the team went to Monaco, because for the first time, both Ferrari cars made Q3. And that's a huge milestone in their season, especially with Massa. He's terrible around Monaco. He even admits it. So, for Felipe to put in a performance like that all weekend, and Massa finishing, I believe, something like 6th. I think he finished in the top 6 in the race. If Ferrari were going places at this point, the car yet again took another step forward at a high downforce circuit, very different to the characteristics of the track they had just been at. So our comments that Ferrari was no longer a midfield car are seemingly confirmed by Ferrari's follow-up performance in Monaco. Any thoughts on that?
So, in my opinion, in Monaco, Ferrari is the fourth best car. It is slower than Red Bull, Mercedes, and McLaren. While McLaren and Red Bull are easily explained why they are better than Ferrari, Mercedes is a bit more curious because the only real feature about the Mercedes is the double DRS. And the WRS does nothing in Monaco. So why were they competitive? The reason is that all the teams for Monaco, they brought track-specific upgrades, very high load rear wing or front wings. But Mercedes, they brought a full-on upgrade package at Monaco. I'm just gonna read it. It's major changes. Basically, they had to redo all the crash tests because after the new gearbox and nose, at Monaco also debuted the tapered sideboards, which required to change the side impact structure. A new horizontal rear brake duct section to lower the center of gravity, therefore also new brakes. Finally, new front wing and rear wing specifically for Monaco. This is a full-on upgrade package that Mercedes brought at Monaco, of all places. And it undeniably worked because we all know that Michael Schumacher got the pole position and would have won without the penalty he got back in Spain. And even then, Nico Rosberg finished second.
Yeah, Monaco is one of the worst circuits for assessing a car's performance because it's so kind of self-limiting in what you can do and because it's so different from every other circuit. And also because if you can lock yourself into one position at the start, you will basically just stay there. And this, again, happened with Ferrari because they qualified fifth and seventh, but then thanks to Grosjean, they were up to fourth and fifth at the start. But then it just so happened that in Massa lost. He fell behind somebody, Vettel, in his first pit stops, and then Vettel managed to overcut him because he ran late and then got passed by Alonso and he pitted. So they ended up third and sixth. But it's a race where this one, the last section of it is actually very interesting to watch because the top 6 drivers are running in a train, and it's amazing to see the drivers that close even today, even though they can't pass each other. But you've got those; they all finished within 4 seconds of each other, and then the rest of the field, the Force Indians, they were 40 seconds behind in their own little train. So it's on pace. It could have almost been anyone that took it. It's just a shame it had to be at Monaco.
Absolutely. By the way, did we speak about the new exhausts that they brought on the car? I can't remember the new exhaust on the exit. It was like a periscope style exit. So it's just incredible that Ferrari are just continuing to bring these mini updates even at Monaco. I mean, it really were. I mean, in a much better position than they were previously. And I remember Pat Fry even saying that had they left Fernando out for a few more laps, maybe he could have passed Rosberg in the race at some point. Like I don't know if that's being a little bit optimistic, but like you said, Peter, they were all running in a train. They weren't far off each other's pace in the race. So the fact that Ferrari think they could have even done one position better and then challenge Weber, I mean, that's incredible to think from where they were at the beginning of the season.
Yeah, Monaco is it was very tire sensitive in as the race developed because how he managed the race was he was fourth. He was behind Webber, Rosberg, and Hamilton in this order. So for the first laps, he let Hamilton go, open a gap to preserve his tires. And then he started to close this gap as they got closer to the pit stops. And he managed to do a one-lap overcut on Lewis Hamilton. And so he gained third place. Meanwhile, behind there was Vettel. So what did Vettel do? Vettel had sacrificed Q3, and instead of running the softest tire, he ran the soft, not the ultra soft or whatever the Pirelli was using at the time. Let's call it medium. He qualified on the medium, so he would start the race on the medium because he and the team expected that in the race tire degradation would be critical. So Vettel wanted to start on the mediums so that he would run longer and he would overcut everybody. And then tire degradation wasn't as bad as they initially thought. So Vettel only managed to overcut Massa and Hamilton, and so he finished fourth, while his teammate won the race. So I don't know. This was a strategic blunder, but I don't know who exactly called it. If it was the team or if it was Vettel's own decision. So that makes six different winners in the first 6 races. We still have one winner to go.
A drive by Raikkonen too, holding off Michael Schumacher and that Mercedes for countless laps. Anyways, it's not relevant. And really, just I think going into Canada, I think Ferrari learned from everything that you just addressed, Ace. And in Canada, this is where I think the Ferrari not only was not a midfield car anymore, it became a top car. It became one of the best cars on the grid. Now we can debate that, but they made a huge step forward in Canada, right? They had a new exhaust layout, kind of similar to the McLaren, and this improved all areas of their car: downforce, tire wear, aero efficiency, and the results were once again easy to see. Third and sixth in qualifying, yet again, both cars in the top six. I mean, incredible to think about it, really. I mean, we have to say the Ferrari was once again hyper competitive in Canada, don't you think?
Yes, in Canada they finally brought the upgrade to the rear end, and not just a temporary fix or a proper fix after some test at Mugello. This was what the car was intended to be. This was how the rear end was engineered to work, and this time in Canada it works. And in my opinion, there's a spell from Canada until Hungary at latest, in which the Ferrari is not only a proper front runner, but a car that should be taking wins. I don't know if it is straight out the best car, because McLaren and Red Bull are very good cars, but it is definitely a car that stands equal to them. I don't know if it is better, but it is at the very least equal to McLaren and Red Bull. So Ferrari is a car that should win races. And in my opinion, Canada is a huge missed opportunity. Canada is where Alonso lost the title, not the incidents, not the probably if Raikkonen had defended had fought better in Bahrain to win against Vettel, or if Alonso had actually overtaken Raikkonen in Abu Dhabi. No, I think Canada is where Ferrari lost the title, because in Canada they made a strategic error. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
I was going to say, it was a circuit that was surprisingly heavy on tyre wear, because this is the one that 2 years ago we had the famous resurfacing of the track, which suddenly made the Bridgestone tyres melt when they would normally last a whole race. And then the FIA were like, oh, well, this is fun. Let's have this every single race for the next 14 years. And in comes Pirelli.
Look, I mean, first of all, Ace, I think you thought you could get away with that little slight on Kimi earlier. This was the man's fourth race back from 2 years out of the sport. Okay? He did phenomenal in Bahrain. All right? We need to stop saying, like, oh, he should have won that race. Yeah, he should have won that race. But as you said, that's not why Ferrari couldn't win it, because Kimi should have won. And there's a huge reason why. And it's great that you both mentioned this, because, you know, this was a race where Ferrari should have finished higher than they did. And with Alonso, it was because of the strategy. And again, people will say, well, what about Massa? Where did Massa eventually finish? Massa spun in this race. He was making up ground quite significantly and made a driving error. So the pace of the car was not in question. The strategy and the driving performance of the number 2 driver very much were. And so let's talk about the strategy error. From what I remember, it was at the end of the race, you know, Alonso and Vettel were at the front and Hamilton was just hunting them down. And as Alonso and Vettel had basically were wearing out their tires, their times just dropped off a cliff. They were multiple seconds a lap slower than what they were previously. And Hamilton passed both of them. And so Vettel stopped for tires to make sure he wouldn't be passed by more drivers, but Alonso decided to stay out. And that was a huge mistake because he would have probably gotten the podium had he pitted, given the pace of the car all weekend. So what you saw was a McLaren, Sauber, Lotus podium when really it very much should have had at least a Ferrari up there with a McLaren and probably Seb too. So that's where I think Ferrari made a mistake, unless there's another area that you were speaking about earlier, Ace. What do you think?
No, I was exactly talking about that. They were Alonso and Ferrari were fighting against Hamilton and Vettel, and they were fighting for the win. So Lewis Hamilton runs the normal two-stopper strategy, as everybody believed that was going to be the better strategy. And so Ferrari, to try and win the race, but also Red Bull to try and win the race, they switched to a one-stopper. And you could see at the end of the race, it wasn't working out. Lewis Hamilton had passed them so easily, and now Grosjean and Perez were also coming hard. And so the real crucial point for the championship at the end of the year is that both Alonso and Vettel were out on world tires, and both had a decision to pit or not to pit. They were both going to lose places by doing this, but they could cut their losses short. So, as you expect, Ferrari and Alonso were unwilling to give up position on Vettel, and so they tried to hang around. Instead, Red Bull was decisive. They were behind Ferrari. They were only going to lose more places, so they pitted Vettel. And what happened at the end? Vettel caught up to Alonso and overtook him. They finished the race 4th and 5th. That means a net 4 points gain by Vettel. If Ferrari instead decided to simply give up and pit Alonso before Red Bull pit Vettel, Alonso would have finished 4th and Vettel would have finished 5th. That is 4 more points at the end of the year for Alonso compared to Vettel, and Alonso would win the title by 1 single point. This is what I mean with Canada. They called the strategy wrong twice. If they didn't call it wrong the first time, Alonso would have finished second and he would have won the title. If they didn't call it wrong also the second time, Alonso would still have won the championship at the end of the year. But they had called it the strategy wrong twice. And that was decisive in the championship standings at the end of the year.
Nothing to add to that. That's exactly what I thought as well. And it just gave them great momentum in a way, knowing that the car was good. But then at the same time, it wasn't just the car that needed improvement. It was also operationally. So that was two of the things holding Ferrari back. It wasn't just that their car started off slowly and then became much better, as we were showing. The team was making mistakes. That was just a wrong strategy call. Really should do better than that. And anyways, at this point, the car really looks like the third best in Formula One. So when they head to Valencia, they knew that they could fight for the podium at the very least if they did everything right, with a driver like Alonso especially. And they, once again, were evaluating new exhausts. So you can't say this team was sleeping with updates. They were trying to bring updates every race and keep pushing forward. And, Valencia was an unbelievable race, unbelievable weekend. What do we think about this weekend, guys? Let's jump into it.
So, in my opinion, Ferrari screwed up qualifying. So, why did Alonso get bumped out in Q2? So, the reason is that Ferrari wanted to risk it, and so they used a new set of tires for Alonso only once because they wanted to save another set for the race, and so by running one less time in qualifying, they would save one set. What this actually did was getting Alonso out of Q2 and not even. Not getting into Q3, Alonso was going to start 11th, and so that incredibly backfired from Ferrari, from their strategic decision. And he got kicked out by Kobayashi by 4 thousandths of a second. So I don't know if Kobayashi did the time before or after Alonso, but it's still such a small margin. And Q2 was all throughout such small margins, because from P11 to P1 or P2, it was 3 tenths of a second. That's extremely close. And we're not talking about Austria, we're talking about Valencia. That's a 100-second lap time, not just a 60 seconds lap time. In the field at Valencia was incredibly close. And then in the race, Vettel should have won it. Vettel was driving an absurd race. Like, out of nowhere, the Red Bull was demolishing everybody.
Yeah.
For no apparent reason, because I'm just gonna look, but I don't think Red Bull brought any big upgrade to Valencia. Okay, never mind. It is a major change to the exploitation of the airflows in the lower zone of the side pods and in front of the rear tires. Compared to the start of the year, the channel was doubled, both in length and width. It starts much further forward, and it splits near the gearbox. One part flows into the sides of the diffuser, the other section exits where the hot air from the side pods flows. This couples with the rear suspension introduced in Canada and a different brake configuration. So yeah, it was a big upgrade, but yeah, the Red Bull still didn't produce another dominating performance all the way until Singapore. They weren't as dominating at Silverstone or at Hockenheim or at Budapest as they were in Valencia. So it was still an incredible performance by Vettel, even with the upgrade.
I mean, Valencia and Singapore happen to be two of his strongest circuits. Because the 2011 Valencia race, very uneventful. He won it very comfortably. 2010, again, he won fairly comfortably. 2008, he made Q3 in that Toro Rosso in the race. So yeah, it's just that. I mean, I think he was about 2 seconds a lap faster in the first stint, and then the alternator died. A lot needed to happen, I think, to give Alonso the win, because he kept making positions at safety car restarts, and I think he had a very good launch at the beginning of the race. But then Vettel retires, and then Grosjean retired from behind him, who maybe could have challenged him, probably would have just finished on the podium. It needed a lot to fall into place at the end in quite a chaotic race.
And it's just something that, I totally agree with both of your analyses. And I think something we need to, again, point out is that, yes, Alonso and Massa were fighting through the field, but they weren't fighting through the field with a slower car. Again, Ferrari made the operational error. This was a mistake from the team that meant they were starting so far back. The car's real position was much further up the grid. In my opinion, somewhere in the first 2 rows, probably. And now some people may say, well, why is Felipe finishing nowhere? Remember, Felipe got hit with debris. And in addition to being hit with debris, Massa also was very unlucky in that the safety car period came right after he had pitted. And in addition, he had a collision with Kamui Kobayashi. So he had the pace and he was making some initial gains early on, but all those things meant he finished absolutely nowhere. And people should remember that. Ferrari were down the grid. And yes, like Peter said, I think without the 2 retirements to Vettel and Grosjean, Alonso likely would not have won that race. But still, it confirms that Ferrari continued to make continued to make performance gains, but they still had work to do in that department. And yet again, they made an operational mistake. You see, it wasn't just that the car wasn't as fast as Red Bull. The team wasn't as good as Red Bull when it came to trackside operations. And so Ferrari continued the rest of the season to address these issues. I mean, that's how I looked at it. A great weekend, but I think Ferrari knew they got a bit lucky that weekend too.
Allora, so yes, lucky. They definitely were with Vettel, and they were also lucky with McLaren and Hamilton, which they butchered the pit stop, and so Alonso got ahead during the pit stop phase. Otherwise, I think Hamilton would have won the race after Vettel's alternator died. And about Grosjean, I think that Alonso overtaking him on the outside at the safety car restart really shows that even if Grosjean had caught up back to Alonso later on in the race before he retired, he still wouldn't have overtaken Alonso. So I think he got really lucky with the safety car timing, with the retirements from Vettel and the problem from McLaren with Hamilton, but everything else was his own doing. And it really is a wonder because Raikkonen and Michael Schumacher were on the podium, and also Raikkonen and Michael Schumacher were knocked out in Q2, right? I think it was Schumacher 12th
He was
and
he was in
Raikkonen.
he was in between the Ferraris. Schumacher.
Yes. So Schumacher was 12th, Massa 13th, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Raikkonen was 14th.
Yeah, you are. Yeah, you are right about that. And are we talking about which race are we talking about here?
Valencia still.
So from what I remember,
Oh, never
Alonso
mind.
was 11th, Michael was 12th, Felipe was 13th, Kimi was 5th.
Yes, Kimi was 5th.
So
Okay.
Kimi was 5th, and then what happened is that I think Alonso just made some incredible gains. I think Alonso had a quicker car than the Lotuses. I just think Ferrari didn't show that in qualifying, and the safety car, helped them. They made some good strategic gains, and yeah, he ended up ahead of Kimi. But and he also became the first driver to win 2 races that season, didn't he? So it just showed, even if the car started outside the top 10, that car was now quick enough that they could come up and finish on the podium on merit. So, frankly speaking, that's impressive. It's not incompetent. I think some of these hardcore Alonso fans need to just tone it down a bit. Ferrari were not totally incompetent at all. They just weren't at the level of Red Bull on both performance or operations, and the team acknowledged that every race. And they really set the tone when they went to Silverstone and got a pole position with Alonso too. So let's pivot to that, because that was sensational. I mean, that was the lap of the season. Unless there's something you want to add, Ace.
Before we pivot to Silverstone, so I want to point out that I know that Spanish fans are absolutely crazy about the Valencia win. I think they shouldn't be, because the Malaysia win was much warfare. It really came from a midfielder car, whilst instead Valencia came from lower down the field because of a strategic error, and the car was actually third best at the very least. So Valencia is much less impressive than what 2012 Malaysia is. 2012 Malaysia remains amongst the best wins in across the history of Formula One, together with Raikkonen 2005, with I don't know many about
Michael Hungary 1998
that
and
one.
Spain
Yes,
96. There are so many.
Mm.
But I actually think what you just said is something I completely agree with. His win in Malaysia was a masterpiece. But his win in Valencia was just excellent, and nothing that was completely out of the order, because, frankly speaking, he had a very fast car in Valencia. He had a horrible car in Malaysia. So, Peter, I'm not sure if you have any additional thoughts on that before we pivot to Silverstone.
I mean, when I did that video a couple of years ago, every 2022 driver's best and worst race, I got in trouble because I made no mention of Valencia at all when it came to Alonso as a good or a bad race. a lot of people were insisting it was his best one. I'm like, okay. And in that video, I was looking at the perspective of driving performance rather than everything else going well. And the same with bad races. I wasn't interested in mechanical retirements. It was, did you drive badly? When I did the World Champions best and worst race, I put that in as just a honourable mention. But my perspective was always, well, without Vettel retiring, he would not have won it. Simple as.
And final thing about Valencia is that Lotus, for Raikkonen, finally got the new power steering developed for Kimi. So from Valencia onwards, Kimi should be at ease with the car. It now behaves how he wants it to behave. Do you have something to say, Ciaron, about?
I mean, this could be an episode in itself, so I'm just going to make this super quick. The man has the softest hands I've ever seen in a Grand Prix driver. So every team he's ever gone to, there have been massive issues with the power steering initially. It took McLaren years to perfect it for him, and he took Ferrari several races to get it anywhere near as he wanted. So I knew when he went to Lotus this was going to be an issue, because the moment he turns the wheel, he wants instant feedback. He wants the car to shoot to the apex, and he will deal with any oversteer through his car control. It wasn't perfect, but Valencia was a step forward with the power steering, because he was struggling all season with just too much understeer in the early races. And there was a big gain in Valencia and then a big gain in Hungary. So you're absolutely right. It was a step in the right direction setup wise for Kimi. Meanwhile, Fernando was also getting the grips with the Ferrari, and we really saw that in Silverstone. What a lap. I mean, I really do think that was the best qualifying lap of the year. And sure, that car is also very good in the wet. Let's be honest. You can't do a lap like that unless your car has some kind of, penchant for being strong in those conditions as well. Let's just go over that qualifying session. The fact that both drivers were competitive, and the fact that the race was pretty good too. Let's delve into that. What are your thoughts on that, guys?
I went to that race. It was it was wet the whole weekend. If not wet, overcast. I mean, there were points of sunshine, but it was never hot or dry at any point. I remember in qualifying there was a red flag, I think, between Q1 and Q2 because of the rain, and it was delayed by like an hour. And me and Dad were sat opposite the pit straight. So the drivers would come out and wave, and people were doing Mexican waves going all the way around from Club and Vale up to Abbey, just keeping themselves entertained. It wasn't a warm weekend at all. It was something where you do better in colder temperatures. And the race was the race was overcast but dry, and it got sunnier as it went on. I was watching from Stowe. But yeah, not brilliant weather from what I remember being there.
But a brilliant lap, all by Fernando Alonso. I mean, I can't hide that. I don't think anybody can hide that. What do you think, Ace? Yeah, what do you think?
I actually think that it is not the best lap of the year. I think the Hockenheim lap by Alonso is better because, first of all, at Silverstone, Alonso during free practice spun once or twice, and then he was out throughout the entire Q3 on wet tires to do the lap. But in Hockenheim, for Q3, he only went out halfway through on a new set of tires because he told his engineers, I just need one lap. Give me minimum fuel and new inters, and I'll set the pole first try. And so his engineers actually only gave him the new tires, but fueled him for the rest of the session. And Alonso still got the pole position.
Okay, we'll get to that when we get to Hockenheim. So I think that is stunning as well. So, we can have different views on that. I think the fact that Alonso beat Mark Webber, who's a Silverstone specialist, in the wet in what I think was the quickest car that weekend is what stood out to me. And Mark Webber was a mega quick driver, and one of his best circuits, actually his best circuit was Monaco. His second best circuit was Silverstone. So it's no joke beating Mark around Silverstone. If you can do that, you are a properly quick driver. And he did that. Unfortunately, in the race, he couldn't hold off Mark. Mark is a beast around this circuit, and he closed in on Fernando and made a beautiful pass, didn't he? At the end of the Wellington Straight. So at the end of the day, the fact that the Ferrari could run with the Red Bull actually suggests that this weekend was probably the second quickest car. Not to mention Massa finished fourth. So they just keep going from strength to strength, and they finished ahead of all their main competitors, including Vettel. Alonso finished second. Vettel finished third. So I think this was a mega weekend for Ferrari. I mean, this was like a weekend that people may just forget because they think of it as like a Mark Webber clinic, which it was. Brilliant drive by Mark. But Ferrari did a brilliant job with both drivers as well this race, in qualifying and in the race, to at least finish ahead of Vettel. Any additional thoughts on that, guys? I mean, maybe you see it differently.
So about Silverstone, I have a lot to say. Not mean one thing a lot, I mean many things. So first of all, about the race. So there is one criticism that can be made to Ferrari, and it is that they should have run Alonso on the softs on the second stint. So on the first stint, it would be on the mediums. Basically, what the Webber did. The point is that Ferrari tried with Massa the soft on the first stint. They expect tot tire degradation, and they found it was better than they predicted. So they could have stopped Alonso immediately for a soft on the second stint. The point is that after they stopped Massa, they needed time to analyze the tires to see how they were holding, and so to estimate the tire degradation. And along that time, they had to pit Alonso. And so Alonso was pitted, and since they couldn't be sure about the performance of the soft tire, they put him on mediums again. And so that basically set up the overtake from Webber at the end of the race, because Alonso on the soft was slower than the Red Bull on the mediums, and so Webber was able to take the run, the slipstream, and overtake Alonso. The only criticism was that instead, in the first stint, instead of pitting immediately after Webber to cover it, to stay out longer, the tire had still some laps left in it, so they could have gone for longer, and so at the end of the race, the tires would have held on better. And instead, it is a matter of 2 laps. Alonso could have stayed out 2 more laps in the first stint, and instead they pitted him to cover Webber. If they didn't, then just maybe Alonso could have won the race. It is a very nip and touch, so just wanna put that out there because it was in the analysis by the Ferrari team at the end of the race. Another thing is what you said, Ciaron, about the Ferrari being second best here. Yes, it's true, and that's because the McLaren is hitting a bad run of form. And before covering McLaren and its upgrades throughout the year, I wanted to wait until Belgium, because that's when their entire upgrade comes up, and so I can explain more how McLaren fared across the season. Just want to say, in Silverstone and in Hockenheim, no, not Hockenheim, in Silverstone, they have problems, and so they are not competitive. And finally, for Silverstone, there begins a trend by Ferrari. So Ferrari brought upgrades across the year. They brought a big upgrade after the Mugello test, and it worked wonderfully well. Then they brought the upgrade at Canada, and the car got even better, and it now stands side to side with McLaren and Red Bull. But from now on, Ferrari will try to work on the wings, on the front wing and the rear wing, to improve aero efficiency, to improve the top speed. And from Silverstone until basically near the end of the year, their upgrades do not work. At Silverstone, not all the new parts worked at 100%, says Domenicali. And they start bringing front wings and rear wings, and then not using them. And I think that was everything I had to say about Silverstone. So we can move on if you don't have anything else to add.
I don't have anything else to add to that. Agreed with all that. And I think if we look at Hockenheim, again, they ran a revised exhaust exit at Hockenheim. The fact is, a new front wing appeared at that track as well, and it's just amazing to see them, once again push the envelope with their development. They never rested on that front. And Fernando continued his fine form and bagged a pole position that you touched on earlier, Ace. Stunning lap. Uh, and it's odd because I know that Fernando told Andrea Stella when he joined Ferrari that Hockenheim was his weakest circuit. This is well documented. He said to Andrea that the one track he feels that he doesn't know how to drive properly is Hockenheim. His lines, his braking, the commitment through the corners. And it's something that I think about because I do think Fernando improved at Hockenheim. But if you think about him saying that this is a circuit he never felt he was good at to Stella, for him to be so dominant suggests that the Ferrari might well have been the quickest car this particular weekend. I'm going to stop now. I'll let you guys jump in. What did you guys think of this weekend?
I mean, another enormous gap between Alonso and Massa. Admittedly, a Massa because Q1 was dry, but then Q2 and Q3 were wet, and then he goes out in Q2. But he eventually finished 12th in the race. I think at the beginning there were a few drivers that got caught out with punctures, and he may have been one of those. But it did mean that at the end of this race, Alonso was leading the championship, and Massa was 14th and had something like 140 points less than him, which is just an absolutely colossal gap. And as we're seeing, not all of that was necessarily his fault, but he wasn't pulling it out of the hat when the car was working, whereas Alonso was every time.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he paid dearly for that collision he had at the beginning of the race. Then I think Ferrari tried to put him on a one stop, and that failed miserably. But what I think they noticed was that his pace was pretty good when he was running in clear air. And Fernando was just stunning. I mean, once he put the medium tires on, I think he struggled a little bit. I think Vettel and Button were closing up on him, but Fernando just managed that in the end. And then Button pitted early. So Ferrari then had a huge advantage to be able to react to that without, having any risk of being overtaken. So good strategic decisions by Ferrari, a great car, a driver on form. I think what we saw was all that coming together and putting in quite a dominant performance. And I actually think that in this race, they had the quickest car in Formula One. Not over the entire season, not up to this point. I'm just saying in this race at Hockenheim, I really think they had the fastest car. And I'll stop there before we pivot to the next race, which was in Hungaroring. Any additional thoughts on Hockenheim, guys?
I think that at Hockenheim, Alonso didn't have the fastest car. As I said before, he had a car equal to McLaren and Red Bull with its own strength, its own weaknesses, and so you can try to win, maybe not exactly being fastest, because we should remember at Hockenheim, Lewis Hamilton got into an accident, so he was out of the race. And instead, the McLaren that was battling was Jenson Button. Now, I think we can all agree that Lewis Hamilton, if it was in Button's place, he would have done a better job in hunting down Alonso. So that already works out in Alonso's favor. The most menacing McLaren is out of the race. But not only it is out of the race, but it is squabbling with Vettel in underlapping attempts and stuffs like that. And then Vettel himself, although he was probably the fastest driver that day, he was first squabbling with Lewis Hamilton, then he was struggling to overtake Jenson Button. And when he did finally overtake Jenson Button, he did it off the track, so he even got a penalty. And so that all came together to help Alonso win. What Alonso did was put a stunning lap in qualifying, although allegedly I believe the Ferrari is better than Red Bull and McLaren in the wet. The Williams is also very competitive in the wet. I think Maldonado was... no, I don't remember, so I don't want to say wrong things.
In the qualifying, Maldonado was 6th, so yes,
okay,
massively quick. He was ahead of both the McLarens and Kimi.
So, okay, I was saying, so I think a lot of things came together, but then Alonso managed the race perfectly. When Button was hunting him down, Alonso did only one thing. He kept all the cares and used it in the straight going down to the hairpin. And as long as he did that, the McLaren didn't have enough speed to overtake him. Alonso kept repeating that, and after some time, Button's tires went off, and so he fell back. And that was it. I don't think the Ferrari was straight out the best car, but it was a car good enough that starting from pole, the car could manage the race and win it. Just like it happened at Silverstone. I repeat, maybe 2 laps longer in the first stint, and the Ferrari would have won also that race. So as long as you play your cars perfectly, the Ferrari is a car that can win races. Now we move on to Hungary, which I think is also the last of the races in which the Ferrari is at the same level as McLaren and Red Bull. Do you have any comments to say about Hungary? Another great drive from Raikkonen. I think he was that race he overtook Grosjean out of the pit box.
Yeah. No, I mean, closing thoughts on Hockenheim. Kimi also did an amazing job to get on the podium that race after Vettel got penalized. So that was a great drive. I don't think the Lotus was on the same level as the Ferrari, McLaren, or the Red Bull. And as we'll touch on later, Ferrari had a much bigger budget than Ferrari, McLaren, and Red Bull had a much bigger budget than Lotus did. So stunning drive.
Yeah, before we move on, you had commented about in Hockenheim that Raikkonen was going to win, straight out win because of the double DRS on the Lotus. Do you want to comment on that?
I actually meant that for Spa. For Spa is, I think, when they introduced something. And I think that might have actually been in 2013. So I may have misspoken there. But I remember they brought something.
Okay, move on.
Yeah.
I have the upgrade list, and it says Lotus in Germany introduced the F-duct on Kimi's car. And for F-duct, I mean the double DRS. Now, it is a passive system with 2 new air inlets at the side of the airbox and a split channel under the engine cover. The lower channel cools the radiators, stick to the lower profile of the engine, and instead the upper channel is channeled by the rear wing profile, and through the lateral dividers it blows on the DRS activation mechanism, reducing the vortices generated and therefore the drag. That was the passive DRS, double DRS that Lotus developed.
Yeah, amazing stuff. I think we should have an episode probably dedicated to that, but for now, let's just move on to Hungary, because it's important now to kind of, I think we've gone through the first half of the season and we still have a few races to go through. So if we think about these races, all these teams are bringing updates, like you just said, Ace, and Hungary was no different, right? I just feel like this was a weekend, like you said, that Ferrari were not quite at the level of Lotus, McLaren, or Red Bull. They were probably the 4th best team. And Fernando, again, just made some great moves in the race to get himself up there. And Ferrari did bring a new front wing end plate for the race too. So not miles off, but then this was a race where Ferrari probably dropped 1 position from being the 3rd fastest in this from the or the joint fastest in the previous race to just behind the top 3 fastest teams in 4th. So that's how I look at Hungary. Ferrari really were not the stars of this race. They were not the main protagonists, and they didn't make any huge strategic errors really. So the grid positions kind of decided the race, and with Felipe, the start had really he just lost a ton of starts. A ton of places at the start, and that's what set up his yet again suboptimal race. So that's how I look at Hungary. Any thoughts, guys?
Yeah, I mean, Hungary, it's a sort of Monaco light. I feel like either Hungary has just been described as Monaco with grass, or Monaco has been described as Hungary with walls, one of the two. Yeah, it's another one where really it's qualifying that dictates where you finish. But fifth and ninth is not too bad. It's with the difficulty of making up positions being so qualifying dependent, it could be worse. But the race in general was not the most eventful, especially compared to a lot of other races that season.
So
Agreed.
for Hungary, there's a lot of stuff to say. So I was already speaking about McLaren. They're bringing across these races an upgrade package. I will comment it after we talk about Spa, which is when McLaren brings the full update. As for Red Bull, for Red Bull, we see that a lot of stuff is getting controversial with the FIA. So the first time I spoke about Red Bull and the FIA was when Dewey had some ideas, extreme ideas, that the FIA turned out and said those ideas are illegal, and so Dewey couldn't develop the car as he intended at the start. Then we didn't comment before because I want to just say the full list. In Monaco, the Red Bull debuted a hole in the floor edges, and at the beginning it was legal. Then the FIA decided to make it illegal. Then in Canada, Red Bull brought drilled wheel nuts. So the wheel nut had some holes in it to improve the airflow around the rim of the tires, so you can control the temperature of it. And it has an aero function. It should be banned, and instead the FIA kept it legal for some races, and then the FIA banned it. Then in Germany, Red Bull was found with non-compliant engine maps. And this is important because this exact moment in Germany with the non-compliant engine maps is the first hint of what Red Bull and Renault are doing with their engine, with the car. I'm talking about the manual traction system in which the Renault engineers have been able to use the electrical unit to, when the driver press the gas pedal in a very quick way, I'm talking about hundreds of a second between activation and disactivation of the gas pedal, it tricks the engine into a fail state in which it cuts 2 cylinders, and so it works only with 6 cylinders. And so as long as the drivers out of the low-speed corners is able to trick the engine into cutting these 2 cylinders, the engine is working on less power out of low-speed corners, and then when the driver simply sets the gas pedal and keeps there, the engine turns back to working with 8 cylinders. So this is a manual traction system. But this thing will only come out at the end of 2013. It is only then that Mercedes and Ferrari figure out what Renault is doing. Until then, Renault is simulating this traction control, which is perfectly legal, I want to point out, because it is manual. It is the driver that activates this traction control, and then so it is perfectly legal. But this is the first moment with the non-compliant engine maps in Germany, for which the FIA lets Red Bull off, in which the others get a hint about this system. And finally, in Hungary, the Red Bull has some manual setup correctors adjuster at the rear, so they can change the rake after parc fermé. And it is again a big controversy, and at the end of the day, Red Bull is let off because the FIA can't prove that they have been using this on their cars. Basically, the same reason as 1994 with the traction control of the Williams. And that was it, I think, about Hungary. On my comment is that I think Alonso underperformed in Hungary. I think that the Ferrari could have aimed for more if Alonso had qualified better.
Yeah, he was only a tenth off Perez and Kimi, so there's an argument for that too. I just feel like the Lotus was so quick in the race that it'd be hard to see how he could have stayed ahead. But you're right, he could have given himself a better chance. Uh, Unfortunately, he had no chance in Spa because I think the Ferrari was also a very quick car in Belgium, as shown by Massa's drive from 14th to 5th. Incredible. But fortunately for Alonso, he was taken out by Romain Grosjean, colliding into Lewis Hamilton, and both of them collecting Fernando effectively. So not much you can do there. That really wasn't Fernando's fault. Definitely Grosjean's fault, obviously. But positives were that in Spa, Ferrari showed good pace with Felipe. Fortunately, he qualified terribly. So not much you can say there, guys. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean that was 6 of the drivers that finished in the points started the race outside the top 10. But that again was mostly triggered by Grosjean's antics at turn 1. Realistically, yeah, just damage limitation. I mean, if he qualified better, he wouldn't have beaten Jensen because Jensen led from the front and was just very good that weekend. I mean, Vettel got very lucky to go from 10th to 2nd in a race where he was probably going to lose even more points to Alonso. But maybe a podium could have been on the cards for Massa if he'd qualified the top 10.
I apologize. I made a mistake earlier. I said he qualified only a tenth off Perez and Kimi in Hungary. I meant only a tenth off Perez and Kimi in Spa. In Hungary, Fernando was a tenth off Kimi in qualifying. So I kind of agree he could have probably done a bit better in Hungary in both Hungary and Spa in qualifying. I do think that Kimi outperformed his car in Spa massively. That all of the Lotus team were saying they did not deserve fourth on the grid, and they certainly did not deserve a podium in that race. They had big handling issues. The car wasn't really suited to that track at all. And I think Perez probably underperformed because if you look where Kobayashi was, the car had a lot more pace than fifth position in qualifying. So, yeah, you could argue that Perez and Alonso slightly underperforming in qualifying, Raikkonen outperforming his car, and maybe if Alonso had qualified ahead of Kimi, he would have avoided that first lap incident. That's a very good argument to make because yet again, Ferrari was this weekend a top 3 car. So I think tied with probably Sauber on pace. So for third position. But at the same time, it's a black swan event. How can you expect a driver to make such an egregious error at the beginning of a race? I mean, that was just disgraceful driving by Grosjean, wasn't it? So, I guess they have to move on to Monza and take those lessons with them. So before we pivot to Monza, any closing thoughts on Spa?
I think that the real miss occasion was from both Hamilton and the Saubers, because the Saubers have qualified incredibly well, and I think Belgium was another track they could have won after
Yep.
Canada, after Malaysia, and probably some other tracks where the car was competitive, but it didn't get the setup right. And I don't want to comment on that because then it's all a guessing game. So I think this is the third occasion that Sauber lost at winning a race.
Look,
And
I want to just interrupt you for a second because I'm going to say this now and I'm not going to bring it up again for the rest of the episode. Everyone talks about like, oh, this driver should have done better this season. That car should have done better. The team that underperformed the most was Sauber this season. They had a car that should have won races. and they couldn't do it because both their drivers were not good enough. Simple as that. Okay, keep going, Ace.
For Spa, I said I was going to talk about the McLaren upgrades and the McLaren trajectory across the year. So the McLaren starts the year as the best car. The reason is that the Red Bull at the first races is struggling with getting the new philosophy at the rear, the Quanda effect. And so both drivers report to the team that the car feels a bit off, it is competitive, but the McLaren is simply better. And then the McLaren is slow, but iffy slow with its upgrades. That is, the first big upgrade that McLaren brings is in Spain, in which they bring an entirely new nose with higher nose and longer flaps. And this means that it is so different, the new front wing, the new nose, that they have to run the crash test again. Then, and this is the entirely new front of the car. Then, from Germany to Belgium, McLaren starts to bring upgrades to the other 60% of the car. So, after the low at Silverstone, in Germany, the car is 60% new. They have steeper sidewalls, much lower down, a new engine cover, a new aerodynamics at the floor edge. Rear wing size and brake ducts were changed. The steeper sidewalls also imply a different installation of the sidewalls and of the manifold of the exhaust. And finally, a revised suspension geometry. This upgrade was followed up in Hungary by a new diffuser with new mini flaps and new rear brake ducts, which have become adjustable from track to track. And finally, in Belgium, they bring a piece with an L shape, but upside down in front of the side pods. And this is Sauber-like, this solution, and it brings better aero balance. And finally, new rear wing for Spa and Monza, as pretty much everybody else. And I wanted to wait until Spa to talk about this upgrade, because after the low at Silverstone, the McLaren makes a step forward. The McLaren really improves with these new pieces. It went from probably alongside Ferrari, Red Bull as the best car, to being the best car at Hungary, where they won, at Belgium, where Button won, and finally, what we're going to talk about, at Monza, where Hamilton won again. What do you guys have to say about the race?
Alonso was out of position in qualifying in Monza. Massa qualified well and raced well, and showed that the Ferrari was yet again a top 3 car, and I think the second quickest car during the weekend at Italy. So, it's unfortunate that Alonso, had to start from where he did. I believe due to circumstances that were out of his control. But at this point, the Ferrari is an elite car. It's a fast car now, and I think the McLaren is quicker this weekend, just slightly, but the Ferrari wasn't far behind. And now, on average, I could say the Ferrari is one of the top 3 cars over the course of the season, up to this point. And that's going to continue as the season winds down. But, I think Alonso's podium just highlighted how good that car was at that track. I also want to point out that the Sauber was also a rocket ship at the circuit too. But I actually think the Ferrari was just slightly perhaps ahead of the Sauber. But it's hard to judge. I think Sauber and Ferrari may have been equal, but whatever the case, Ferrari is one of the top 2 quickest cars that weekend, in my view.
Helped by this being one of Red Bull's weakest circuits. Of course, they were all about the corners but didn't like the straights. And even without retirements for, both of them in the end, they were on course for 6th and 7th. So yeah, not really a bit of an anomaly for them.
Alonso had a lot of misfortune in this weekend, but it is not without a common problem. So the common problem is the crash at Spa. The chassis was completely, the car was completely ruined, but the chassis was still safe. So for Monza, Ferrari simply fixed the chassis on Alonso's car, but it is basically the same car from the crash at Spa. And so across the weekend, the following failures happen on Alonso's car. So in free practice, the engine on Alonso's car breaks. Then, always in free practice, Alonso has brake problems. And then on Saturday, still in free practice, Alonso's gearbox hydraulic fails. Finally, in qualifying, the anti-roll bar fails. And so that happened in Q3, and that completely ruined his qualifying, because the anti-roll bar failing means that basically the rear end of the car is set up for wet weather, because it is in wet weather that the teams simply disconnect the anti-roll bar so that there is no the rear tires can turn at different speeds, and so that is very good for wet weather. But that was dry weather, so you need an anti-roll bar. And when it broke, Alonso was basically lapping with a wet weather setup, and that explains why he was starting 10th. And I think it was promising that was also the last failure until the end of the year, because he could have retired during the race, but instead all the failures happened during free practice and qualifying, and so he still finished third. If we wanna remember a more recent situation, was Leclerc crashing in 2019. The Ferrari had to rebuild the car, and then when they tried it out, the car failed, and so they couldn't get to start the race. Instead, in 2012, they had 1 week to repair the car and several free practice sessions. And so Alonso avoided another DNF, but it was very likely. And given the problems he faced in free practice. And so third place, although it probably isn't as good as it could have been, still should be taken as a positive result.
Agreed. I think it was positive. Car went through a lot of places and set them up well for Japan, which was the next race.
Singapore.
And I apologize. The next race is Singapore, not Japan. And in Singapore, similarly, they probably had a top 3 car behind the McLaren and the Red Bull. Alonso is also mega around this circuit, as we know, one of his best tracks. And Fernando bagged the podium, while Felipe went from 13th to 8th. So, again, this car is not slow. This car is not a midfield car at this point. This is an elite car. This is one of the top 3 cars on the grid with the full might and budget of Ferrari behind it. So fans need to understand that when they're listening to this. Okay, the car started off as a back marker. Now it's one of the leading cars. And quickly, my thoughts on this race were simply that, Fernando drove a very just consistent race. I don't think he made any real mistakes, and Ferrari called the strategy right. In that, they made the stops at the right time. They benefited from Hamilton's retirement. And Fernando just brought it home in a podium, which is where I think it should have finished. And Massa really carved his way through the field. I mean, Massa finished 8th, right behind the 2 Lotus cars in that race. So, good momentum again for Ferrari. I mean, they've shown they can get podiums at pretty much every circuit now.
Massa had another first lap collision, so he actually went from last to 8th, effectively.
And still made his way back.
Yeah.
Right? So that just highlights how good that car was at that circuit. So
I think that from Singapore onwards, there is a crucial difference. Yes, the Ferrari is still a top 3 car, But I said before, from Canada to Hungary, it is side by side in performance with the McLaren and the Red Bull. But from Singapore onwards, actually from Hungary onwards, it is no longer the case. I explained that in Spa and Monza, the McLaren was the best car because they brought an upgrade package. Well, from Singapore onwards, it is the Red Bull that starts to become better and better until it becomes the best car. Because at Singapore, Red Bull brings a new upgrade package, and it is a big one. It is a new evolution from the Belgium weekend, because they actually brought this evolution back in Spa, but during free practice it rained, so they didn't use it, and they opted to simply run it at the next proper race, which was Singapore. And so this evolution is all around the rear end and the suspensions. Changes on the diffuser profile, along with a heavily revised rear wing, new front wing with revised flaps, new brakes disc by Brembo for Ferrari too, these discs, and different brake ducts, an entirely new nose, a longer one, which then was not used in the race weekend but will be used later on. And these upgrades in Singapore by Red Bull are then followed by further upgrades in Japan, Korea, and India. And these are the 4 races that Vettel win in one after the other in absolutely dominating fashion. And this is the turning point of the championship. From Singapore onwards, well, actually, from Japan onwards, the Red Bull becomes the best car. The Red Bull starts to work as Newey wants it to. And Red Bull, again, like 2011, starts to simply destroy everybody else, to simply dominate.
Completely agree with that. I think at the end of the day, Ferrari drew level, and then they once again started to fall a little bit behind. But again, key point, you're still in the top 3 overall. And if you go to Suzuka, look, I mean, the Ferrari was clearly a rapid car this weekend because I think it was probably tied with Sauber for 3rd place or for 2nd place yet again. I think Jensen did a stunning lap in qualifying, honestly. And then you saw the Saubers out qualifying Alonso and Raikkonen. And you saw Massa once again going from 11th to 2nd. Okay, this car was rapid at Suzuka. And Alonso made his biggest mistake of the season, in which he tried to intimidate Kimi Raikkonen off the road at the first corner, gave Kimi no space, and that resulted in a needless collision, which resulted in Alonso retiring from the race. I blame Alonso for that incident. He tried to intimidate the bravest driver in Formula One, and that failed miserably. So that's what you get, as Alonso would say, karma.
I don't think at all it is a fair representation of what happened. So
Okay.
I think it was a pure racing incident. So Button was moving to the side, he was closing on Alonso, and Alonso started moving left. But on the left there was Raikkonen. So now, these are racing drivers. They do not get scared. They do not give up to avoid a collision. They fight for their ground. Raikkonen had no more room left to go left, so he didn't move left. Alonso wanted to go over Raikkonen to not give him space, and so he tried to hang around there, and they came together. It's a racing incident because you cannot expect a racing driver to simply let another through or to give up. They wouldn't be racing drivers otherwise. This is stuff that happens on lap
Yeah.
1, and I don't think neither is to be blamed more than the other. It is a racing incident. And also, it was unreasonable to expect of him to leave Raikkonen room given that he was ahead of Raikkonen, and it was unreasonable to expect Raikkonen to back off because otherwise he wouldn't be a racing driver.
Just look at Massa's onboard at the start. Alonso has the Pacific Ocean to the right of him. I mean, he has so much space, and he just chooses out of ego to squeeze Ferrari's last world champion. That was a driving error that, could have been avoided if Alonso had just moved to the right. He had plenty of space, and if you look at Massa's onboard, you see the gulf of space that he had. And, because of that, He tried to intimidate Ferrari's last world champion, and that remains Ferrari's last world champion because of that mistake by Alonso. And I just urge people listening to look at Massa's onboard of Suzuka 2012, and you will see Fernando had tons of space to his right. Tons. So I don't agree with you, Ace, but as usual, I definitely see where you're coming from. I just don't agree.
Another point about this race is the actual performance of the car, because Vettel absolutely dominated Japan. He finished 20 seconds in front of Massa because he managed the race. He opened a 10-second gap in the first 15 laps, and then he simply stopped pushing. He managed that 10 seconds, and they became 20 by the end of the race. If Vettel was pushing, he would have finished 1 minute ahead of second place. And the real key to read this championship is that from especially Japan, but also from Singapore, but especially Japan, Red Bull is the fastest car. McLaren can hold on to their pace, but not always. And then Ferrari is the third best car and can't really fight with the Red Bull unless with circumstances that favor them. And so, unlike before from Valencia until Hungary, which Alonso can fight and can hope to beat the Red Bulls, from now on, it simply is no longer possible. The Red Bull is too superior to the Ferrari, and Ferrari is simply not bringing any upgrades of themselves. They're bringing new front wings, new rear wings, and they don't even work half of the time. And when they do work, they are an improvement of thousandths of a second, but the gap is tenths of second. So Alonso is simply fighting a losing battle from Japan onwards. He exits Japan with a 4-point advantage over Sebastian Vettel, with 5 races to go. And Vettel has clearly the better car than Fernando Alonso. So it is a losing battle. Simple as is. In Japan, the McLaren, looking at the free practice performance, was probably the only car that could compete with the Red Bull and Webber with Vettel. But Webber was taken out by Grosjean. Hamilton, before qualifying, he out of nowhere changed the setup completely, because we should remember that this is after the incident in Belgium in which Hamilton leaked the setup of Jenson Button because he thought McLaren was favoring Jenson, and so now Hamilton is starting to looking around at leaving McLaren and will soon sign for Mercedes. And among all this, there's Hamilton, and he's starting to get paranoid. And so in Japan, he out of nowhere changes the setup from FP3 to quali, and the setup is a complete mess. And so Hamilton isn't competitive in Japan. Button is, but Button has taken a 5-grid penalty for changing the gearbox, so he's fighting with the Sauber and the Ferrari and can't hope to go and take Vettel for the win. So that's the story of Japan. Red Bull clearly fastest, probably McLaren second, able to compete with them, but then it's Ferrari and everybody else not hoping to compete with the Red Bull. The following race is Korea, and here again, Red Bull is bringing upgrades. In Japan, it was a double DRS system active. In Korea is a new rear chassis, a new shape to the final part of the sidewalls, shorter, with the aim of maximizing the double DRS effect on the car. And in Korea, once again, the Red Bull is absolutely dominating the race with Sebastian Vettel. What do you guys have to say about this race?
I mean, I don't remember this race. I don't remember a huge amount about it. Korea is one where the 2010 race was quite memorable, but then the ones afterwards didn't really land. Ferrari overall had a good race. I mean, they went from, what was it, 3rd and 5th to 4th and 6th to 3rd and 4th because McLaren had a bit of a mare. It's that, yes, in the second half, Red Bull were much stronger. Ferrari had obviously improved in the second half of the season as well, because if you think from Hungary onwards, Massa had gone from being useless half the time to then scoring points in every single remaining race and getting 2 podiums of his own. And then from Spa onwards, or from Italy onwards, every time Alonso finished, he was second or third. So they had they kind of sorted that out. The consistency was far better. It's just that they were now at least second fastest, because Red Bull was so much stronger. So they were still doing good. It's just that while Alonso lost a lot of points in Spa and Suzuka, Vettel lost a lot in Valencia as a counter to that.
And Malaysia.
And Malaysia, yes.
And then he will lose a lot in Brazil too.
Yes.
So clearly Vettel was the more unlucky driver, because Alonso on his own really only lost 8 points in Canada, and if we are to believe Ciaron, also a fair amount of points in Japan. And then by pure unluck, he also got in the crash at Spa, which he has no fault at all. So it definitely is Vettel was more unlucky along the year, which is the main reason why Alonso could fight for the titles for so long. If it wasn't for the retirement in Valencia, Alonso would be out of Hungary, I think 12 points ahead of Sebastian Vettel. And yes, so by Spa, Vettel finished second, so Vettel would be 6 points ahead of Alonso. Then 12 points behind Alonso. No, 9 points behind Alonso in Italy, because Vettel retired and Alonso finished third. And then from there on, Vettel is simply leading the standings from Singapore onwards. So Valencia in particular, but also all the unlucky moments, are what really kept the title open. But Vettel was more unlucky than Alonso. This is also true. I also think that Vettel, overall the year, had a much better car than Alonso.
Definitely. And I think the key is here is that in Korea and in India, which we can pivot to now, Ferrari had, I think, the joint quickest car, or second quickest car over the weekend. Maybe McLaren had a slight edge in quality, but the Ferrari had the edge in the race. And India was an interesting weekend, because this is where Alonso and Pat Fry got into a massive argument, because Pat Fry basically accused Alonso and Massa of not being perfect in qualifying, and being out-qualified by Red Bull and McLaren should not have happened. Pat Fry basically said that Fernando should have been ahead of the McLarens in qualifying. And he was right, because again, we can see Ferrari are bringing upgrades every race. Ferrari are bringing whatever they need to make this car quicker. And it was the second quickest car, as Peter said, by this stage in these races. And that's an incredible effort by Ferrari. And don't forget, in India, there was some Indian customs issues that prevented Ferrari from bringing certain parts because of the paperwork that was associated with that. So, all things considered, for Alonso to really underperform in qualifying and still finish second, under 10 seconds behind Seb, is just a testament to how good that Ferrari was at that point. So another strong weekend in India overall. Not enough to beat Vettel, but the car is quick. There's no other way to put it at this stage. This is not the same car as we saw in Australia. This is a transformed car. And Fernando was getting called out by his team for underperforming in qualifying. Any thoughts on that?
I don't think that Ferrari was second best in India. I think it was very close with McLaren. I think that McLaren should have finished ahead of Ferrari, but instead Alonso made a strong start. He overtook Hamilton, and then he set up the overtake on Button on the straight perfectly, so that he came out ahead. And from there he simply managed, and he went on to hunt down Mark Webber. And then he wasn't getting past Mark Webber until the curse on his car died. And so I think Webber could still finish ahead of Alonso, because by India, the Red Bull is absolutely a monster. Okay, I need to read this out loud. The Red Bull in India is running a huge rake. Everybody runs the front 3 centimeters high from the ground and the rear 8 centimeters high from the ground. the Red Bull runs 3 at the front and 12 at the rear. So the 3 at the front is forced by regulations. And why then is Red Bull running 12 centimeters high at the rear? Because rake is paid with aerial resistance. So the rake is a consequence. It is not a choice by the team. It is a consequence of other properties of the car. It is impossible to increase the load on the front of the car because of the rules. Red Bull therefore runs the rear end very high to give more inclination to the front wing and therefore load. This is forced by the fact that they found a lot more downforce at the rear. So if they don't balance it with more downforce on the front too, the car becomes very unstable. This is just how much rear downforce the Red Bull generates. It is so much that they have to run the rake almost double than the others to compensate and get more downforce at the front too. This is how well Newey is getting the command effect to work on the Red Bull. This is the advantage that the Red Bull has. And so, even if Mark Webber was without cares and so couldn't defend himself, it was still impressive that Alonso could overtake him, because the Red Bull simply should drive away in the corners. This is the advantage they have. Any thoughts? Anybody want to add anything else to the race? Or we can finally move on to when the tide turned against Vettel.
Yeah, Abu Dhabi was a rather more entertaining spectacle to see. Yeah, for me, yeah, it's one of Vettel's best drives, having gone from the pit lane to third. Quite a lot went on in that race. Again, more Grosjean, more antics from him. I think Maldonado was either crashed or broke down and was doing well himself. So one of the few times that Abu Dhabi has actually been genuinely entertaining without being a title decider. But Ferrari themselves, it was just it's more just attempting damage limitation, really.
Yeah, I think that Red Bull probably had the quickest car this weekend, then McLaren, and then Ferrari. I think Kimi just honestly drove the wheels off his car all weekend. I really do believe that the Ferrari was probably third quickest this weekend. Lotus fourth. And I think Hamilton's pace showed that, that McLaren was clear of Ferrari and Lotus. But Vettel's pace showed that I think the Red Bull was the quickest. That was obviously a very quick car, but also, yes, an incredible drive by Vettel. And one that didn't allow Ferrari to build out as much or claw back as many points as they were planning. They did not expect to see Vettel on the podium at the end of that race. But, both Ferrari drivers, again, finished in the points. Alonso second, Massa seventh. So, the team's competitive. The team's able to pull out these good results and do it consistently. It's just that the Red Bull is just a little bit too quick, as you both mentioned. It's the quickest car in Formula One at this point. And there's nothing you can really do about that unless it breaks down. So, heading into the final two races of the season, I don't think anybody thought that Red Bull would be in anything less than a position to win the final two races. What do you guys think?
I mean,
Well, go on, Peter.
I mean, Kota is it's a bit more of an unknown because it was a brand new circuit, so no one really knew exactly how people would perform there. Looking at it, you would think, oh, this plays to Red Bull's strengths with that first sector of lots of high-speed corners. It's very much like Suzuka. But the track was incredibly dusty, very, very low grip all weekend because it was brand new. And Hamilton, even though Vettel got pole, even without Carter Kane allegedly blocking him and letting Hamilton get in DRS range, he probably would have caught him anyway. But yeah, Ferrari they dipped again because they qualified what was 7th and 9th with Massa beating Alonso, but then Massa had a grid penalty and it ended up being 7th and 11th for them. But then they finished 3rd and 4th, although they were 40 seconds behind Hamilton and Vettel. So it just becomes a case of damage limitation at this point. But there is a recurring trend in that Massa's pace relative to Alonso is improving, and he is closer to him in this second half.
This is all down to the improvement of the car and also the understanding of the engineers. Because at the start of the year, the Massa was heavily disadvantaged by the problems of the car. So this is a comment at Valencia. Massa found a F2012 difficult to drive because the technical staff following Alonso kept stiffening the front end, making the car more and more undrivable for Felipe. As the upgrades start coming and as the understanding of the car and of the tires improve, Massa starts to come back and he starts to become competitive. At the end of the year, there is also a question mark because Ferrari is rushing small upgrades, small pieces, and they're putting them on the car of Alonso because they're desperate for the title. And so some say that actually what they put on Alonso's car work worse than Massa's car without those pieces. So they think that some of the pieces they brought at the end of the year actually made the car worse. And so that also would explain why Massa was closer to Alonso. Another common opinion is simply that Alonso had kept all year driving his heart out for a car, out driving it constantly, and so after 18 races of this, Alonso was finally starting to show the signs of wear, and so at Kota his qualifying was bad. He qualified bad. He made a mistake and he was down. He qualified ninth. Then ahead, I think it was Grosjean who had a penalty, so that would have promoted Alonso to eighth. But that eighth was on the side of the grid that was dirty. So this was the race where Ferrari broke on purpose the gearbox of Massa's car so that Alonso would be promoted to seventh on the correct and grippy side of the grid. And yes, it is a very dirty move to hinder your driver to help your other driver. It also is a move that absolutely worked, and it is if Ferrari finished third and fourth, it is all thanks to the start. So it is a very hard to judge decision by Ferrari.
Yeah, I mean, everybody knew that even numbered side of the grid was a mess for the start. So I remember Kimi saying he'd rather qualify fifth than fourth. And he was annoyed that Grosjean had to take the penalty because that meant Kimi had to start fourth. And he had a disastrous start. So Ferrari called it right. It's a pretty dirty move, but that's what you have to do in the heat of a championship. But Ferrari has a very fast car. You know, it's the third best car that weekend, and it finished on the podium with Massa only, 6 seconds, 7 seconds behind Alonso. You know, come on, guys. This car is properly quick.
Also,
Hamilton. Go ahead.
Hamilton that they drove an incredible race because
Yes,
Red Bull was the fastest car. I explained why when we were talking before about the rake, and it shows that at Abu Dhabi, Vettel drove a phenomenal race. He got lucky with the safety cars. When he damaged the front wing, so he had to pit sooner, turned out to be a blessing because it worked very well with the safety cars that came out a bit later. But other than that, the Red Bull is running a very high rake, which means a lot of aerial resistance, which means the Red Bull does not have the top speed. So making overtakes, recovering so much, even if there was luck involved, it is still an incredible drive by Vettel. And it enhances even more, in my opinion, what Hamilton was able to achieve at Austin, because the Red Bull was clearly the best car. There was no reason to believe that the McLaren could be not only competitive and on the same pace as Vettel, but Hamilton actually won. He overtook Sebastian Vettel. So, incredible drive by Lewis Hamilton that day.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, one of his best drives for sure. And I think unless it was wet, I don't think any car was quicker than the Red Bull at this point in the season. I really don't. Um, and, when we went to Brazil, we saw in qualifying that Seb was just 2/10 off his own teammate, who was barely behind the two McLarens. You have to say if Seb had done a better qualifying lap, maybe Seb could have been on pole in Brazil. I don't think that's out of the question at all. And then again, in the race, when it started raining, the Ferrari was super quick. I mean, we'd seen that all year. That Ferrari was a great car for the wet, and it gave Massa and Alonso confidence to go out there and attack. It's just that I think, the McLaren was probably a little bit quicker than the Ferrari, and we know how good Jensen is in those kind of conditions as well. He looked imperious, didn't he? So,
I don't know if he... go on, Peter.
There does seem to be a recurring theme I noticed around that time of people at Interlagos driving overly cautiously or qualifying overly cautiously when they're fighting for the championship. Because we'd seen this, well, basically all the years before. 2007, Hamilton was, lower than he should, and then just ended up making, well, he was making silly mistakes before the gearbox died. 2008, he should have finished way better than fifth, with Massa going on to win it. 2009, Vettel and Button both got themselves knocked out in Q2 in very heavy rain in qualifying, and what were the two fastest cars at that point. And then again here, Vettel's out of position, has a poor start, and then he ends up getting spun round. It's just making things really difficult for themselves, whereas Alonso was just kind of on it. I mean, we saw he did that double overtake on Massa and Webber at the start of the second lap, I think. And I mean, later on, Kobayashi pulled a number on him and Vettel too. But he was, just kept keeping it at the front. It wasn't quite enough at the end because Vettel had made the gains he needed to, even with his floor and side pod damage, and with him, coming into pit without telling the mechanics because his radio was broken. And again, Massa was there with Alonso the whole time, so it wasn't like he was just miles behind, and he very easily could have been in a race as chaotic as this.
Exactly. I mean, they finished second and third. Both Ferraris finished on the podium and demonstrated that their car was probably quicker than a lot of those cars on the track that day. I think it was probably the third quickest car again that weekend, but again, it was a top 3 car that could, especially in the wet conditions, challenge the cars even in front of it. So, all in all, Alonso lost the title, and he gave himself a chance to fight for this title because of his stunning performances in the first 3 or I'd say first 5 races of the season, where Ferrari started off with a horrible car, yet Fernando could still salvage a win and some really good points out of it. And ironically, when his car became quicker, I actually think he probably didn't perform as well as he would have expected, mainly because I think he made some mistakes like Suzuka, but also because Red Bull's development rate was incredible. They really did out-develop the other teams yet again, Adrian Newey's brilliance. And so he ended up losing the title, but he deserved to lose it, I think, because he made a mistake. And it's not true that Fernando was just dragging a car to positions it had no business being in the second half of the season. I think him and Massa were pretty close in the second half of that season on pure pace. And ultimately, in a season where all the drivers had bad luck, you'd have to say Vettel probably had the worst luck. And even though he drove pretty badly in Brazil, I think deserved the title. And finally, I'll sign off here by saying that I think that, yes, the Red Bull was the quickest car over the course of the season. McLaren was second, very close behind. And I think Ferrari was the third quickest car on average over the season. And that's far from being a terrible car, especially a car that at some races was the joint quickest. That's just, a car that's competitive. And with an excellent driver like Fernando, could achieve some results it probably didn't deserve to, but overall didn't deserve to win the championship. And that's what I think about. That's what I think about it, anyways. Thoughts on that, guys?
Yeah, I mean, what everyone says usually, they'll say, "Oh, Alonso, he was winning races in like the fourth best car or something," and I'm like, it wasn't the fourth best car when he won his 3 races, but also, no one car that year had a fixed position for the whole season, which was not even HRT, which was what made the season so good. Is that for about half of the season they had the second fastest car, and so they weren't. It wasn't like it was always fourth fastest, because you can even say the difference is like someone we didn't talk about much was Mercedes, is that they started the season very strongly, although there were a lot of errors that took away, meant there were several non-finishes, but then in the second half they just evaporated and they went something like 7 or 8 races without scoring any points when they'd won a race in the first half of the season.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like it was all there were points early on in the season when it was the fourth fastest car, and those are the ones where they were off the podium and Massa was just nowhere to be seen. Yeah, from the second half onwards, it was the second fastest, and that's when all the podiums were coming and everything. And yeah,
it ebbed and flowed, as you say. The form depended on the circuit, and one thing I think that, apart from the fact that yes, Red Bull outdeveloped everyone, I think part of the reason Ferrari also inevitably clawed back a lot of their deficit was that Ferrari's a massive team. They had a much bigger budget than even Mercedes and Lotus, especially Lotus, that season. So, with that kind of money, I mean, and a technical team of Pat Fry, Simone Resta, Nicholas Tombassis, Alfa Romeo's chief designer Yan Wanshou was on that technical design team. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but big names. It's not really that surprising that they made such massive gains over the season. And overall, the car, I think if I had to net everything, judging off what you just said, Peter, I'd give it third quickest over the course of the season, while acknowledging that form could differ on a track-to-track basis.
How many titles have been won on the third best car in the history of Formula One?
Okay, so I knew you were going to ask that. And the problem with this question is that it wasn't the third best the whole season, right?
But
it was sometimes on average.
For the races in which the Ferrari was equal to the McLaren and the Red Bull, there are just as many races in which the Ferrari was a straight-up midfielder.
So he didn't win the title. Alain Prost won the title in 1986, which is one of the most incredible things I've ever seen in Formula One. That McLaren was way behind the Williams Hondas, way behind. I mean, it really wasn't as close as anybody, thinks. And if you actually look at the standings in '86, Senna finished in a Lotus ahead of one of the Ferraris and ahead of KK as well. KK finished behind. Alain finished first. KK finished 6th in the championship. Okay, so we've seen drivers with cars that are not the best, and perhaps even third best at some circuits, win titles. Alain Prost did that. Michael Schumacher in '97, I really think that Ferrari improved over the course of the season, like Alonso's did. And I think Ferrari followed a similar trajectory, because I think Benetton and Williams, and at some races McLaren, were quicker in '97. Yet Michael took it to the last race and was going wheel to wheel with a Williams Renault. And then I'll finally point out Kimi Räikkönen in 2003. He had the third quickest car all season, a car that wasn't being developed because they were too busy focusing on the MP418, which was a disaster. It never was released. And the bloke finished 2 points off Michael Schumacher in the championship. So it's not often that you see someone with the third fastest car challenge for a title, but all I'm trying to say, Ace, is that it has been done before. And we can't forget that. This was a great season by Alonso, but it wasn't the best season by a driver in F1 history. It was one of the best seasons, not the best season. I think Prost's '86 towers above this. And I think this Ferrari was nowhere near as bad as all three of us have proven and discussed in a way on this episode. It was a competitive car. And frankly speaking, between some of the operational errors, like in Canada, which you mentioned, Ace, and some of the driving errors Alonso made in China and Japan, the title slipped away from them. And that's how it goes. So that's how I think about answering that question, if that makes sense.
I mean, I can add to that both of Schumacher's Benetton titles. That was the second best car. I mean, his teammates said the car sucked and they couldn't drive it. He was just flattered by the fact that Damon Hill was driving the best car both times. And Williams were just doing a 24 McLaren and doing everything they could to not win in 1995. Keke Rosberg in 82, though, that car wasn't turbocharged. Ferrari and Renault both had turbo cars, but the Renault's turbos never worked, and Ferrari was constantly trying to kill its drivers and succeeded at one point. It's so that one is thing is people say consistency won it. He wasn't even that consistent when you look at it. He won one race, but very outlier. That was not a particularly competitive car. It's just that it handled well but had no power. And then you could say 76. Because of circumstances out of their control, is that Ferrari was far better than the McLaren. Not so much in qualifying, but in race, absolutely. It's just that, he missed 3 races or whatever it was. Other than that, it's basically always been the best car that does it. We got very close in '99 with Irvine because Hakkinen was just doing whatever all year, and Otherwise, you have to at least have the first. You're very lucky if you could do it in the second fastest car, but it doesn't happen very often. Third fastest. Not really, no.
So it happens very often that a driver wins the title on the best car, quite obviously. It has happened before. It is not often, it is uncommon to win the title on the second best car. And if we go as far down back as third best car, we only see drivers getting very close. It is even more rarer than titles on the second best car. And nobody actually won the title on the third best car. Raikkonen got very close. He didn't have the final luck at the end. Same could be said about Alonso about 2012. Same could be said about Schumacher. For if you wanna put the 97 Ferrari as third best, was it the second or third best? The 97 Ferrari.
You know what? That's a phenomenal question that we don't have time for on this episode, but I think that there's a strong argument that Ferrari was third best because that McLaren was unreliable. Remember, Hakkinen lost 2 or 3 wins easily in addition to Jerez that he won because his car broke down in the lead or when he was in a competitive position. So I'm not going to say that Ferrari was like some midfield car. It got so much better as the season went on. I actually think the 97 Ferrari may well have been the third best car on the grid. If you look at the whole season, I really believe that. I really think by the end of the season, Williams and McLaren were quicker. And that's why they also allied. They did the secret alliance that Williams would help McLaren and vice versa because they knew Michael was just such a monster. They needed both of them to take him down. So that was incredible. Nobody did an alliance against Alonso, And you're right. I mean, the only season I would say that somebody won it that you could maybe argue third best was 86. But if I'm being honest with myself, I don't think the McLaren was slower than the Lotus, or definitely not the Ferrari. So, yeah, I think in modern history, you're right. Nobody has actually won the title in the third best car. Kimi came closest in 2003. What a title that would have been. But overall, Alonso didn't have a terrible car over the course of the season, and I think that other drivers like Michael in 95, in 97, did a better job with their car and given the competition they had than Alonso did. Prost in 86 broke the Williams-Honda partnership. They were so furious that they lost to an inferior car that they decided to cancel their long-term commitment to Williams. How crazy is that? Kimi Räikkönen had a 1-year-old car and was taking the fight to Michael Schumacher and Juan Pablo Montoya. So listen, I just don't think this is the best driven season of all time. And I don't think this is even close to the worst title contending car of all time either, because it got better. It's one of the best driving performances of all time. I put it as my fourth best all time driving performance from a driver in a car that wasn't the best. So behind Michael 97, behind Michael 95, behind Kimi 2003, and then I put Alonso 2012 in those titles where we say, or championship seasons where we say the driver who didn't have the best car did a phenomenal job. I said, who did I say? Sorry, I said Michael 95, Michael 97, Kimi 2003. Oh yeah, and Prost 86. So actually, I rank it as the fifth best season in that regard, and I think we've proven why. So, this car got so much better as the season went on. So, hardly a back marker.
I think that what really killed it for Ferrari was being unable to improve after Canada. If Ferrari had been able to, I don't know, develop the WRS system, which they never did, or make some other major changes to the car so that it could make a real step forward, Alonso would have won the title. I think that there is one big mistake, which was Canada. There was one opinable mistake in Japan, and then everything else, it was Alonso really driving his heart out. So I think it speaks for itself, the fact that we consider only 3 performances in the history of Formula One, which got very close to the title on the third best car: Schumacher, Raikkonen, and Alonso. So already the fact that Alonso has one of those 3 performances already says everything. Yes, it's not the absolute best in the history, but when you're cherry picking to try and compare all these incredible performances, you start to cherry pick, because yes, Schumacher in 97 drove an incredible season, but at the last race he made a mistake which is uncommentable. He literally drove into Villeneuve. So Alonso did not do such thing.
That's true. I can't. Yeah, I mean that's a no. Michael was a disgrace in that final race. I don't know why he even did that. It was totally unnecessary.
And the worst thing, he didn't even realize what he had done. He got back to the garage and thought he was right. There were all the Ferrari mechanics around him, and they had to sit him down and explain that no, he was wrong. It was his fault. And then if you want to compare Raikkonen and Alonso, Raikkonen also did mistake in his 2003 season. The qualifying mistake in Canada, I'm thinking of. And
and Spain.
And also 16 races instead of 20. So I guess, it's all cherry picking. I could, if I think that the Japan incident was a racing incident, then Alonso's season already looks much better, because there was one error and it was a strategy mistake. So if instead we believe that the Japan incident was Alonso's fault, then it already starts looking weaker than 97 or 2003. And if we consider a stupid decision by the driver to be a really bad mistake, then the 97 Schumacher season looks much worse than it would to someone else. I think Alonso's 2012 season remains one of the best seasons in the history of Formula One. Don't know if it's the best. It's not the only incredible performance there has been in the history of Formula One. We cannot argue this. Prost, Schumacher, Raikkonen, now Verstappen, they all drove. Even Hamilton in 2018 they all drove incredible seasons. They just didn't have the third best car. Maybe if Hamilton in 2018 had the third best car, he would have done an incredible season, almost got the title, and we would celebrate his 2018 season much more than we do now.
Peter, thoughts on that?
Well, he'd have been in the Red Bull, so the engine would have been blowing up every other race, or he'd have had Max driving into him, one of the two, unless he was against Ricciardo. I wanted to throw in, because, I mean, you say, like, Alonso, 2005, that was the second best car. It just didn't, the engine didn't go nuclear every other race.
Second fastest car, but best car overall, because you cannot put the McLaren ahead considering the reliability they had. Alonso had the best car, second fastest, but overall best.
I agree.
And you could throw a similar argument. I was going to think of Jody Scheckter in 1979, in that Williams and Ligier had a faster car. It's just that the cars kept collapsing under the weight of their own ground effect. And his car never broke down. And he also didn't drive it needlessly, kind of recklessly, like Gilles Villeneuve did.
That's good. That's a good shout. Yeah. They're all great seasons. I think they all are unique in their own way, and I think we can all acknowledge that each of those years the drivers had some mistakes and they had some outstanding moments. To me, of all these seasons, Prost 86 is the greatest season I've ever seen a driver drive. It was a season where the Williams Honda had a big advantage, and to this day we have not seen a driver in a clear second best car, like with that kind of margin to the Williams Hondas, outsmart both of the Williams Hondas and win a title. We haven't seen that since 86. And for that reason, I hold 1986 as the benchmark season. You want to say you have the best season of all time, compare it to Alain Prost in 1986. And I can almost guarantee that you will not have had a season like that. That man took a McLaren that should not have won the title and beat two dominant cars with two incredible drivers in Nigel Mansell and Nelson Piquet. And it remains the greatest achievement, I think, in Formula One history. And not only was it an achievement on track, it helped McLaren so much going forward, because Honda broke their relationship with Williams because of this. They were infuriated with what happened, as they should have been. No driver has done that. No driver has won a title under such circumstances, and furthermore destroyed the opposition in the process. Not just for that season, for the seasons to come. So that's why I say, like, I still think Prost 86 is the season, while giving credence to and respect to Alonso's 2012 as being slightly lower on that list. I will finish off by saying this. Fernando was the best driver in 2012. I think we can agree on that. Well, at least that's what I think. Peter, maybe you disagree. Ace, maybe you disagree as well.
No, I agree. Alonso was the best driver that year.
I think he was.
I mean,
not by as big a margin as people think. Peter, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I suppose he had more obstacles to overcome than Vettel did. Vettel himself made relatively few mistakes. I mean, far fewer than, say, 2010 in that season. It's just that, it was very, very up and down. The McLarens made way too many mistakes. Weber was just...
hang on. Peter,
himself.
do you think Vettel was the best driver in 2012? Because I've seen many people make a great argument for that.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's fair.
He pulled it out when he needed to. It's just that he had... His big loss was Valencia, which wasn't his fault. Malaysia, it's kind of there or thereabouts, because Carter Kane's defense is that he got pushed onto the marbles and there's no grip there, and Vettel was basically trying to push him off the track. Beyond that, it was only very slight things, like Spain wasn't a brilliant race. Other than that, there was the penalty in Germany. It was quite small errors compared to 2010, where he collided with Weber and then collided with Button, did something else somewhere amongst a myriad of mechanical problems that made what should have been an easy title campaign quite a difficult one. But yeah, I think he was incredibly strong in the second half of the season, and was helped enormously by what happened in Spa and Japan.
From Singapore to India, Vettel was setting a record for the most consecutive kilometers led in Formula One, and it stretched from lap 23 of Singapore all the way to the last lap of India. And it was, I think, up until then, I don't know about today because this is data from 2012, so it doesn't cover the next 12 season. It was the fifth best performance in this regard in the history of Formula One, and it couldn't go on because of circumstances outside of Vettel's control. That is, starting from the pit lane in Abu Dhabi. Otherwise, Vettel would have extended it up until lap 40 something of Austin, and that would have been an all-time record. So I absolutely agree that Vettel, when the car became alive, Vettel absolutely crushed everybody, like he did in 2011. And he was the best driver at the end of the year because Alonso was starting to wear out, I said before. But if you look before, along the year, there are many small mistakes, wrong choices. I said in China he chose the wrong package for the car, and it was less competitive, and so he finished behind Webber. Then in Spain, there was an underperforming show. There was Canada was a strategic mistake. I already talked about how Ferrari messed it up twice, but I also said that Red Bull made a wrong strategic call in Canada. And the same for Monaco too. And then at Silverstone, Webber won and Vettel was third. So he simply didn't dominate Mark Webber as much as Alonso did on Massa. And I don't know where you guys place Webber and Massa relative to each other. Go on, Ciaron.
Weber at that point was a much quicker driver than Massa. I don't think anybody can dispute that. I mean, Mark Webber, first of all, he dropped off in 2013 pretty massively. But before that, I mean, Mark is one of the quickest drivers on pure pace in Formula One. No doubt about it. So that actually makes Vettel's season even more impressive because I don't think people realize beating Mark the way Seb did is not easy. Okay, Mark was a seriously good driver. So it's funny, after our discussion today, now I'm having second thoughts about, who really was the best, because even if I still put Alonso as the best that season, it's not by a big margin. So
There was the
yeah, it's as simple as that for me.
there was the common consensus that the traction control system of the Renault engine was developed especially for Vettel. Vettel was able to make those very fast inputs, and the other drivers like Raikkonen and Webber couldn't. So this traction control was developed especially for Vettel, and so he had an advantage. I don't know how much further I can push this, because then it's all the more a merit to Vettel that he was able to extract this. What he was able to do, what other drivers of Raikkonen and Webber's level were not able to. So yeah, it's inconclusive. I don't know what to make of it. Certainly, the traction control, the manual traction control, was developed for Vettel, but also the other drivers could use it and were simply not able to. So a big advantage, but also a big merit.
I don't want to really get into that, but I think bottom line, the Ferrari was much quicker than the public perception suggests, and Fernando's performance was not that much better than Vettel's over the course of the season, if at all. So I think those are the two takeaways that I've drawn from this discussion today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
And where do we
Frankly,
put Hamilton then? Because people also say that 2012's Hamilton was excellent.
Yeah, so I don't ever put a driver who tweets his team's telemetry, crashes into Maldonado, and generally speaking, had some, just generally speaking, I think there were some races where, you have to say, like, McLaren could and should have done a little bit better. They had the second quickest car on average. And even if you look at all the bad luck he suffered, would not have finished behind Kimi Räikkönen in a Lotus that wasn't being developed past mid-season. They just shouldn't have. Button had a horrific season. Hamilton had a better season than Button, way better. But because he had so many mechanical issues, he finished only 2 points ahead of Button. I still don't think his season overall was as good as that of Alonso or Vettel. I really don't. Vettel didn't cream into the side of Maldonado, did he? So at Valencia, Hamilton was good that season. I just think Vettel and Alonso were better, and I could make an argument that Raikkonen was also better. So I've never been someone that believes Hamilton's 2012 was like a Kimi 2005 scenario where, he was so much better than everyone else. It was just the car letting him down. Yeah, he also made some pretty big mistakes in the races, or at least in Valencia. And then he didn't have the mindset of a champion at all. You don't tweet your team's telemetry because you're angry Jensen got pole. That's totally unprofessional. That tells me you're still immature as a driver. So that's my view on it. I think at best I'd put him third. Frankly, I'd put him fourth that season where he finished. But hey, look, that's just my opinion. Maybe you guys disagree.
Yeah, the pecking order in 2012, it continues to fascinate everybody and to see where everyone really stood. And I'm sure our listeners will let us know their thoughts in the comments. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to check in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.